seminario del Boletín Informativo Techint. Seminario que afortunadamente lo hacemos presencial, no como el año pasado que tuvo que ser solamente virtual. Así que doble bienvenida y gracias por acompañarnos. La pandemia que aún persiste y la invasión rusa a Ucrania están debilitando progresivamente las perspectivas económicas del mundo. La escalada de las tensiones entre China y Estados Unidos tampoco ayudan a reducir la incertidumbre sobre el futuro. La economía global está entrando en una fase recesiva y el aumento de la inflación, que está obligando a los bancos a aumentar las tasas de interés, va a dificultar una salida rápida de esta crisis. Aunque no se descarte un soft landing, las tensiones en los mercados de crédito, debido a los altos niveles de endeudamiento tanto públicos como privados, no excluyen la posibilidad de un hard landing. Según el reciente World Economic Outlook del Fondo Monetario Internacional, el crecimiento de la economía global será del 3,2% en 2022, y luego de haber registrado un incremento del 6,1% en el 2021. Se estima que la tasa de inflación será del 6,6% en las economías avanzadas y del 9,5% en las economías emergentes. China se contrajo en el segundo trimestre como consecuencia de 2 meses de clausura y aunque muestra señales de recuperación, en el tercero no alcanzaría a crecer más que el 3,3% durante el año. Se espera que en el 2023 la política monetaria restrictiva comience a tener impacto sobre la inflación y el crecimiento mundial se ubique en torno al 2,9%. La guerra ha complicado el comercio mundial de energía y cereales, además de otros commodities y bienes, generando en todos los países una situación de escasez alimentaria y de energía. En muchos de ellos, la frágil recuperación post-COVID se ve amenazada por los aumentos de precios en la energía y los alimentos, que se expresa en mayor conflictividad social e inestabilidad política. Es probable que el proceso de globalización no desaparezca, porque ha sido el motor de la reproducción de riqueza en los últimos 30 años, pero probablemente será atenuado por el desacople de algunos eslabones. La globalización no está muerta, está cambiando. Estamos presenciando además la ruptura o fragmentación de las cadenas globales de valor que durante los últimos 30 años fueron de las principales características de la globalización. Este fenómeno implica en el presente y futuro un ajuste difícil, costoso y conflictivo. La pandemia mostró los costados vulnerables del proceso de offshoring. China, que venía teniendo un rol protagónico en el crecimiento mundial, priorizó sus necesidades domésticas y retuvo los insumos farmacéuticos de empresas internacionales localizadas en China. Más tarde, la crisis energética que resulta de la guerra en Ucrania generó consenso acerca de que los insumos energéticos no deben depender de proveedores de países autocráticos. Sobre este punto, la Unión Europea ya ha proclamado el objetivo de lograr su autonomía estratégica, es decir, autoabastecerse o aliarse con proveedores confiables. La demanda de energía hoy es mucho mayor a la de los años 70 y esto debido a la incorporación de Asia. Y dados los problemas que ha generado la guerra, se observa un aumento en las inversiones en la producción de combustibles fósiles, muy por encima de las alternativas ecológicas. ¿Cuánto tiempo más se postergará entonces la agenda del medio ambiente? Los gastos de seguridad también requerirán el aumento del gasto público. ¿Se postergarán así los gastos sociales? Estamos en un momento en que el comercio internacional no parece poder garantizar el crecimiento, el orden y la paz, en el que asistimos a la transformación de las cadenas globales de valor y en el cual la geopolítica no podrá ser ignorada por la economía. Los cambios en la configuración geopolítica del mundo que el mundo está impulsando a las empresas globales a replantearse en dónde ubicar y reubicar sus cadenas de suministros. Los países de América Latina y el Caribe se encuentran en una posición inmejorable para fortalecer su inserción en las cadenas regionales, por los recursos y capacidades con los que cuentan algunos sectores. No obstante, para aprovechar estas oportunidades, las empresas de la región deben enfrentar dificultades que ya existían antes de los shocks del 2020, relacionados con los costos del comercio, el transporte, el cumplimiento de regulaciones ambientales, la logística y la inestabilidad jurídica que se observa en algunos países. El Estado, así, tiene un rol importante en apuntalar el proceso de inserción de las empresas locales en las cadenas globales de valor. El esfuerzo debe estar puesto en estimular la atracción de empresas globales, el nearshoring y también el friendly shoring, pero también en lograr una mayor integración con las empresas de cada país que aumenten el contenido local. Hay productos y procesos industriales que tienen oportunidades de generar exportaciones indirectas en las principales cadenas globales de valor. ¿Cómo encontrar esas empresas? ¿Cómo capacitarlas? ¿Cómo identificar lo que se necesita para favorecer el proceso? Ello requiere coordinación público-privada, además de una buena armonización intrasector público. ¿Cómo generar esta relación público-privada? Mediante una nueva articulación entre mercado y Estado que debe combinar políticas de desarrollo productivo y garantizar un buen clima de negocios. Mejorar, simplificar y eliminar regulaciones, proveer infraestructura de transporte y de energía. El cambio abrupto del contexto internacional puede ser aprovechado por los países de la región. Las oportunidades están. Se requiere imaginación, aptitud y condiciones macroeconómicas estables para poder hacerlo. En este seminario intentaremos discutir las características y las consecuencias de esta múltiple crisis mundial, política, social, alimentaria, energética e inflacionaria. Estamos frente a un proceso que estaría transformando la estructura de poder del mundo. El cambio geopolítico mundial, sobre todo la relación China, Rusia, Estados Unidos, y la discusión sobre el futuro de la globalización desde una leadership unilateral en Occidente a una multilateral que pone atención en las empresas nacionales, la posibilidad de mantener la agenda verde en un contexto de crisis energética, el aumento del gasto en armamento y la desigualdad en términos de ganadores y perdedores de la globalización serán los temas que discutirá el profesor Adam Tooze, director del Instituto Europeo de la Universidad de Columbia. El doctor Timothy Sturgeon, investigador del Industrial Performance Center del MIT, nos hablará sobre lo que está ocurriendo con las cadenas globales de valor que tienen base en los países más desarrollados. ¿Cuáles son los cambios que se produjeron después de la pandemia y del inicio de la guerra? También nos acompaña el profesor Andrés López, director del Instituto Interdisciplinario de Economía y Política y exdirector de la carrera de Economía de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, y discutirá el estado actual y las posibilidades de América Latina para insertarse en las cadenas globales de valor. Los dejo con ellos. Buenas tardes.
Agradecemos al ingeniero Guillermo Hang, director del Boletín Informativo Techint, por su discurso de apertura del XVII Seminario Internacional del Boletín Informativo Techint. Algunas consideraciones para aquellos que nos acompañan en forma remota. El seminario se desarrollará en español, pero si prefieren seguir al Dr. Tooze y al Dr. Sturgeon en inglés, podrán hacerlo cliqueando el botón Idioma original que encontrarán debajo del reproductor de video. Para ello, es necesario que la pantalla no esté en formato full screen. Luego de la exposición de nuestro primer orador, el Dr. Adam Tooze, haremos un break de media hora. En el segundo bloque hablarán los doctores Timothy Sturgeon y Andrés López, y al cierre pasaremos a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas que tendrá como moderador al doctor Gerardo della Paolera. Los asistentes por streaming podrán enviar sus preguntas a través del formulario que encontrarán en la página. Ahora sí, a continuación, el doctor Tooze, El doctor Adam Tooze desarrollará su exposición sobre el tema del nuevo contexto internacional, cambios políticos y rupturas. Adam Tooze obtuvo su doctorado en Economía en la London School of Economics y actualmente es director del Instituto Europeo de la Universidad de Columbia. Es autor de los libros El apagón, cómo el coronavirus sacudió la economía mundial, Crash, cómo una década de crisis financiera ha cambiado el mundo, El diluvio, la Gran Guerra y la reconstrucción del orden mundial entre 1916 y 1931, Statistics and the German State entre 1900 y 1945, The Wages of Destruction. Ha publicado también artículos en los principales diarios y revistas como Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, entre otros. Dr. Tooze, lo escuchamos.
Thank you so much. I hope my mic is still working. It fell off my belt just a second ago. We all good at the back with the sound? It's okay? It's good. Okay, excellent. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us. Apologies for speaking in English. And well, we have a full agenda. Let's see. Yes, there we go. The themes that I was asked to talk about are daunting in their range and complexity. The geopolitical and economic impacts of the pandemic, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the future of globalization, inequality, the green agenda, relations between China and the West, competition between democratic and autocratic areas. I mean, if one was handed that list on a menu, you'd say this restaurant doesn't know what it's about. But the fact of the matter is, this is the daily agenda of anyone thinking about global affairs in the current moment. It's in fact, though unreasonable, simply what we expect to understand on a daily basis. And, but I will take it as my task today to really offer an overview of the complexity of this mess that we're in, and hope perhaps in the subsequent discussion that more constructive answers will emerge, and specifically those which relate to the question of global value chains, on which my colleagues are much greater experts than I will ever be. What is clear, however, if we simply face up to the fact that this is our agenda, as unrealistic in some ways as it must seem, as incoherent as it must seem, is that we have changed the world that we're in. We're clearly no longer in a world of depoliticized global economics. We're no longer in the world in which, in 2007, the legendary chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, could blithely tell a Swiss newspaper in response to the question of how he was going to vote. It was a stupid question because Alan Greenspan was a Republican and everyone knew it. So it was clear how he was going to vote. But nevertheless, they asked him how he was going to vote. And Alan Greenspan's answer was, it didn't matter. It didn't matter how you vote in a presidential election in the United States, because we're fortunate that thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the US have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, and the proviso is interesting, it hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces. Now, I don't quote this to make Alan Greenspan look ridiculous. I think this was the common sense. When he said this, no one thought Alan Greenspan's ridiculous. It was organized around three basic assumptions. First of all, that global market forces govern, and their government is broadly benign. It's not a matter for concern. That party political differences are not very important. So we have democracy, but it's kind of low stakes. And thirdly, and this is really fascinating in retrospect, that somehow national security was a distinct realm from global market forces. That these two things were not related to each other, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense to say the basic business is done by the market, and then there's this carve-out, which is national security. Right? This is no longer the world that we are in. Nor are we, and this is just to reinforce the point, and then don't focus on the picture for a second, focus on the quote. We're no longer in a world in which it makes sense for somebody like Tony Blair to lecture his party, the Labour Party, the closest equivalent to the Peronist party that we have in Europe, perhaps, in which he says, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. This was Tony Blair in 2005, the same Tony Blair who was cavorting with Putin in the south of France in 2001 in the company of Bob Geldof and Bono of U2. We're no longer in that world either. We're no longer in this world. We're no longer in the world of the 1990s and the 2000s, the period of the first great value chain push. And what's so fascinating about that is, after all that it took place, it provoked a huge shift in the global division of labor, but it was not brought about by deliberate policy in any macroscopic sense, though of course national policies did matter, or the absence of national policy did matter. It was above all driven by corporate strategy. It was industrial policy driven by industrial corporations. And it went hand in hand, at least at the level of policy discourse, with an outright rejection of a pretension to picking winners. Nevertheless, we saw this radical change. And as you can see, even in these numbers, since the early 2010s, we have no longer been in the phase of the rapid development of global value chains. Clearly, we're no longer in a world in which arguing about globalization is as fruitless as arguing about the seasons. Otherwise, I literally wouldn't be here this afternoon. We're in a world of headlines like this, practically everywhere. And I quote these two, again, because Adam Tooze on the one hand of the Peterson Institute and Larry Fink are surely, if there are serious observers of the world economy, they are amongst them. And they are, in this moment, in this year, posing precisely this question. But as our chair and the first speaker this afternoon, I think very nicely put it, there is only a limited value in defining things in negative terms. Deglobalization, I think, is not actually a helpful way of thinking about our current moment. Globalization is not ending in any simple sense or going into reverse. It's far better, as he suggested, to think about a rewiring of globalization or a global gear shift, or as I put it, somewhat melodramatically perhaps, a crisis of globalization. And in crisis, I mean not specifically, as it were, a moment of drama or disaster, so much as the more deeper, more authentic Greek meaning of the word krisis, which is a moment of decision or choice, a turning point, a moment in which one's destiny is decided or determined. And that does seem to me quite a good way, perhaps, of capturing the state of the world in the current moment. Or at least that will suffice as a way, perhaps, of bundling the challenges which you asked me to address this afternoon. Before we go there, though, I think it's important to add a proviso. Many of us here this afternoon, are, you can tell the jet lag, many of the people here today are economists. And it's important, I think, to recognize that as significant as politics and geopolitics are in disrupting the current situation, and I will say much more about those in a minute, and driving the gear shift, it's also true that economic forces alone would in many ways predict a change in the pattern of development over the last decade. Why? Because in a sense, that first phase of globalization in the 90s and 2000s and the form that we took for granted after the end of the Cold War was driven by the incorporation of China into global value chains, and the economics of that, forget the politics, the economics of that have fundamentally shifted because China is no longer a low-cost producer. And that has opened up in the global value chain system a variety of births. And one of them, most perhaps dramatically, is the opening up of the very low-cost textile sector, which has opened the space for major players like Bangladesh to merge into that space. Now, Bangladesh is doing it with Chinese technology, with Chinese capital, with Chinese raw material inputs, but they are inserting Bangladeshi labor into the value chain in a very significant way. Bangladesh's garment and textile exports are now larger than those of its much larger neighbor, India. So that's one possible arena. And here, of course, is the other question, the perpetual question of where Latin America might fit and whether Latin America might, in fact, also find spaces for itself in this arena, the question that was already put on the table earlier on, and I take to be the question that hangs over our entire meeting. As you can see here, China is now relative to a significant number of EM and Latin American players in particular, a high unit labor cost competitor, or cost per hour. But we can only go so far with this kind of economic relativization of our current drama. Significant as it is, I think we have to recognize the fact that we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be speaking about a crisis if we felt that that kind of economic explanation was ultimately sufficient to describe the kind of jarring shift in the balance of the world economy which we're experiencing. What is striking, in a sense, in the last decade, perhaps slightly more than a decade, really the period since 2008, is how many of the critical heterodox critiques or just simply standard lines about the global economy have come to become, well, if not vindicated, I say vindicated here, but to be common sense almost in our understanding of the frailty of the global economy. And I've compressed here in a rather dense passage on this slide the range of dimensions in which this is true. I think we have given up the illusion that was inherent to Greenspan's comments that globalization was geopolitically innocent. It isn't geopolitically innocent. It does create interdependence. It doesn't necessarily lead to peace. Globalization clearly does generate widespread benefits, but it's not a simple formula for win-win social harmony. Distributional issues are key, and we have to take them extremely seriously. Globalization generates solutions to the Malthusian impasse on resource scarcity. This has been an argument for liberalism and free trade all the way back to the age of David Ricardo, but it also implies and multiplies environmental risks in a way which can prove disastrous. Technologies that private business generates, one of the ways in which we break out of the Malthusian impasse, are again and again miraculous, but the politics of technology, the geopolitics of technology, the distributional politics of technology have to be posed. We need to ask ourselves whether we're getting the winners that we need from this process. Globalization spreads technological progress and development, no doubt, but it also entangles countries in financial relationships that are opaque and highly unstable and periodically prone to explosion. And globalization frees commodities and capital, and that in some sense is a powerful, and sometimes it appears as though it's an attractive second best option, second best as opposed to the, in liberal terms, complete freedom of all factors of production. But at some point, the fundamental and jarring disjunction between the freedom of movement of capital and commodities and the continuing bar to the free movement of labor is going to come back to bite you in tense arguments around issues like immigration and migration and the aging of labor forces. And all of these tensions, it seems to me, have come very much to the fore in the last 10 years, and they provide a way, if you like, of structuring and understanding the range of themes that you've asked us to discuss this afternoon. Each one of your themes, the geopolitics, the future of globalization, inequality, the green agenda, can be mapped onto these tensions within globalization, which have come so much to the fore in thinking over the last decade, and constitute, if you like, at the intellectual, cultural, and political level, this crisis of globalization of which I speak, which, to reiterate, is not necessarily a retreat of globalization, but it's a sense of disorientation, a sense of lacking purpose, a sense of lacking clarity. In the Greek terms, a challenge to the identity of the globalization project. Since 2008, I would argue, and I'm in my historian's mode here to a certain degree, business leaders and policymakers all over the world have woken up with a bump to the ambiguity of each one of these trade-offs. And not just one at a time, and this is what's really, I think, characteristic of our current moment, but we face these challenges simultaneously in what I've come to term a polycrisis. In other words, the combination and interaction of these challenges is what defines our current moment, not their occurrence individually, but their concurrence as an entire complex of factors. I take this notion of polycrisis from what may be, in fact, a perhaps unlikely source of intellectual inspiration, but nevertheless, credit where credit is due. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who coined this term, in fact, he borrowed it from a French theorist of complexity, Edgar Morin, and started using it extensively in 2014. And I made it into one of the organizing terms of the book I wrote about 2020 called Shutdown. When Jean-Claude Juncker invoked the term in 2014-2015, he was thinking about Europe, and this is the list of problems that he had on his mind. The Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis that struck Europe from Syria in 2015, Ukraine 1.0, populism in the manifestation of Brexit, and populism in the manifestation of Trump. These were, I think, broadly speaking, and permit the slightly foggy chronology here, what people would come to identify with the notion of polycrisis in Europe from 2014 onwards. If we invoke the term now, I think all of these issues are in various ways still on the agenda, but we would add a further list. We would add China, on the horizon perhaps as a geopolitical challenge in 2014-15, but not yet in the form that we recognize today. Ukraine 2.0, obviously, COVID, the much greater awareness of the urgency of the climate problem since 2015, the challenge of big tech to global governance, and another lost decade, which is kind of what it adds up to in the emerging market and low-income country world. And I'm using that as a summary for all of the problems of countries outside the advanced economy sphere. And when you try and map all these forces, when you try and constitute a picture of how they interact. You can do this in lots of different ways, and different types of modeling exercises will produce different diagrams. But the sort of image that I have started employing, and I warn you that what I'm about to put up next is really more a rhetorical exercise than an actual effort at analysis, is a picture like this. And you see what I mean about a rhetorical exercise. It's a mind map kind of gone wrong, or rather it's the inside of a rather disturbed mind, which is, I think, the state of those of us attempting to think about. And as I say, essentially the average newspaper reader on any given day when you open the newspaper today or yesterday or the day after tomorrow, this, broadly speaking in analytical terms, is what confronts you. And it's obviously not a pretty picture. So let me do in what I want to use the rest of my talk this afternoon to try and pull out some of these threads, give them a little bit more structure, and relate them iteratively back to the question of global value chains, which I know is at the heart of our discussion. And I hope will make this very general overview useful for the rest of the afternoon. One point, which I think it's important to make, given the current tone of debate about the Ukraine war, is that though the escalation of tension between China and Russia is shocking, it should not have come as a surprise. There really was no reason to think of this as surprising. Essentially, both Putin and China's regimes define themselves, have always defined themselves, have done so quite explicitly, if one was willing to listen, through the rejection of the West's victory in the final stages of the Cold War between 1989 and 1991. Now, there is nuance, and Beijing will talk in a different tone of voice at various moments. But fundamentally, of course, everyone who has held power in Beijing since 1989 has been an inheritor of the massacre that took place in Tiananmen Square that summer. And Putin could not have been more explicit about the fact that his regime and the reconstruction of Russian power, as he spelled out at the Munich Security Conference in February 2007, was about the revision of what he regards as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, namely the collapse of the Soviet Union. Global growth brought prosperity to both these regimes, and there were essentially not one but two sides to the gamble that was involved. We were really only aware of one side. The West gambled that integration into the global economy would lead to convergence. But what I don't think we were sufficiently cognizant of is that Moscow and Beijing were taking the other side of the bet. And the other side of the bet was that prosperity would not lead to convergence, but would lead to the strengthening of their autonomy. The West may have turned a blind eye to this, but this was in fact the story of globalization from the 1990s onwards. Furthermore, the Western elites stacked the odds against themselves. If we're trying to understand the mess that we're currently in, we should recognize not just the challenge that comes from outside, but the sequential failure of Western elites to improve their odds of coping with the polycrisis. And the very least you can say is that we didn't. We stacked the odds against ourselves, particularly in the United States. The dramatically incoherent response to the impact of globalization on the American workforce has essentially landed a turd in the punch bowl of globalization and trade policy forever afterwards. In Washington today, globalization, trade, value chains, outsourcing, market access are poison in political terms. And it's not difficult to understand why. The basis for it is essentially the result of the David Autor et al. And his various collaborators on their account of the China shock. Now, these numbers are significant. As you can see here, the surge in the scale of Chinese imports to the United States appears to be closely associated with driving inequality in the US. These numbers are significant. Are they large enough by themselves to explain the polarization of American politics? I'm a skeptic on that score. But when you think about the logic of politics, it doesn't have to be the case that economic consequences translate one-on-one into social inequality and thereby into resentment. But these data do provide the raw material for political entrepreneurship, both on the American left and the American right, which since the early 2000s has blown apart what was in fact always quite a fragile coalition around neoliberalism and the widening of trade in the United States, the last great victory of which was the welcoming of China into the WTO. And from there onwards, really, there's very little prospect of making any further progress. And these data do, I think, illuminate that basic point of America's political economy. Then there's 2008 to 2012. Again, a dramatic failure on the part of Western elites to rise to the challenge of understanding the danger and complexity of the system which globalization had created. They didn't, after all, need to look far beyond the experience of emerging market economies, sophisticated, intelligently managed emerging market economies in the 1990s and the early 2000s to see the risks involved in deep financial integration. And yet, nevertheless, we walked with open eyes into what we inappropriately describe as the global financial crisis of 2008, which was in fact a North Atlantic financial crisis taking down the European and American banking system on a scale which I think very few people in the West and in the North Atlantic system believed possible. We were on the precipice of something like a Great Depression-style collective bank failure. We could have seen it coming, but the conviction that the financial system of the North Atlantic didn't need governing went so deep that we exposed ourselves to gigantic risks. Subsequently, I think somewhat, as it were, euphemistically recoded as a global financial crisis. And then there's the domain of foreign policy. Of course, it's true that Russia and China are major aggressors. But it's nevertheless evidently also the case, if we're honest with ourselves, that a succession of illegitimate, incoherent, and reckless foreign policy moves by the Western powers, notably the Anglo-American intervention in Iraq in 2003, the intervention in Libya in 2011, and Ukraine in 2013-14, and that's a complicated story we could get into. Whether in the West we accept this criticism or not, in the eyes of the wider world have fundamentally delegitimized Western power. And astonishingly, even after the confrontation in Russia over Ukraine and Crimea in 2013 and 2014, significant elites in Europe did not just not back away, but doubled down on their dependence on Russia for gas imports. These are the numbers for Germany, and you can see after the Crimean crisis in 2014, an increase in Germany's dependence on Russian gas in the aftermath. Faced with all of this, I would say, the Western elites deserve to be in an even worse position than we currently are. I think this is the sobering fact of the situation. We should not be surprised that the world did not rally to the Western cause earlier this year when we called for votes in the United Nations to sanction Russia. For many in the world, Russia and the Chinese model look comparatively attractive, and even if they don't, they're damned if they're going to be signing up for an appeal to solidarity with the West. What has miraculously come to our rescue is the recklessness of Putin himself, Russia's military overconfidence and incompetence, and Ukrainian resistance. We really have no right for the map to look the way it currently does on the battlefields of Ukraine. And if we're honest with ourselves in the West, we didn't expect it. We didn't credit the Ukrainians with the ability to achieve this result. We thought they would be rolled over and we'd be sanctioning Russia in the aftermath. It's their heroism and their skill which has enabled them to fight the Russians to a standstill, and of course, an opportunistic decision by America's strategic elite to pile in on a large scale, back Ukraine up, and use this unexpected, in many ways unwelcome, but nevertheless historic opportunity to drain the military power of Russia as far as they can. But the significant point to make here is that any European and anyone thinking about the Ukraine from either a Ukrainian perspective or a European perspective misunderstands the fundamental basic logic of American policy in the region at this point, which is not directed towards Europe, it is not directed or informed by a clear vision of a stable and peaceful Europe in the aftermath. It is essentially a realistic, opportunistic, high-risk gamble that this presents an opportunity to attrit Russia with a view to weakening the Russian-Chinese alliance, which is the real nightmare of American grand strategy going forward. And that is sobering and ought to be sobering for everyone interested in European stabilization, because America in its current mode does not need a peaceful modus vivendi with Russia. Europe existentially does. And right now there is a fundamental divergence, I think, brewing between those two different perspectives. In any case, it is absolutely, it was sobering to discover in the spring of 2022 the governments representing more than half the world's population were not willing to vote with the West on the United Nations resolutions condemning Russia. For a variety of different reasons, few of them having to do with principle. But nevertheless, at that moment, we could not corral significant numbers of players within the G20, notably South Africa and India, for instance, to the Western cause as we saw it. And our efforts to strong-arm India into a common bloc have failed. At that basic level, we have to accept, in light of the egregious nature of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that the moral and political legitimacy of globalism in the sense the West has understood it is at this point extremely threadbare, if perhaps not simply worn out. And that is something we have to deal with realistically. It's uncomfortable, it's extremely unpleasant, it's unintelligible at some level because Russia's aggression is so egregious, but it's a fact that we have to deal with. It's clear that a large part of the rest of the world, so-called, would basically like to shrug and dismiss, I think, the Ukrainian war as relatively insignificant for the affairs of the world at large. And why should they not, in some sense? Why should this concern them after all? There's a feature, I think, of polycrisis situations, and speaking to Argentinians, people have frequently made this observation to me, that if you're in the middle of a polycrisis, it's very difficult not to imagine that your situation is the worst in the world and in some sense is the most important, because you are in the middle of a polycrisis and everything's coming at you. It feels as though the entire weight of world history is on your shoulders. And if Argentina regularly feels like that, the Europeans have been feeling like that since the 24th of February. From the point of view of the wider world, it's a misunderstanding of what the Ukrainian war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, means. But by way of two global markets, whether the rest of the world likes it or not, it is enrolled in the shock. And those two markets are, of course, the energy and food markets. The important point to make about both of them, and it goes back to my skepticism about the centrality of the war as a world historic event, is that both of these markets were already massively stressed before Putin's invasion. It is going to be one of the sleights of hand played by defenders of the so-called rule-based liberal international order that they will credit Putin with having disrupted these two markets, whereas in fact we clearly know that neither of them was in balance even before Putin invaded. There was a fundamental, not malfunctioning, but rapid and severe adjustment of supply shortages and imbalances in demand already underway in 2021. In the energy case, you could say that the Russians were already playing hardball in gas markets. That doesn't really explain it. It's the unbalanced recovery of China that blows the gas market up in 2021. But what those two price shocks have done is to produce three things, right? A surge in those two price sectors. Secondly, a cost of living crisis. And thirdly, a global panic about inflation. But it's important, I think, to separate those three dimensions out. The energy and food markets have a logic driven by their own microeconomics and geopolitics. The cost of living crisis is a reality for every society with substantial inequality. And what's really remarkable about the current moment is that you can actually draw a line between the current debates in Argentina about subsidies for energy, the situation in Pakistan, which has similar debates going on about the viability of energy subsidies there, and conversations in Europe over the same issue. Now, I don't mean to make a false equivalence here. These situations are different in scale, proportion, and their significance in terms of the macroeconomics in each case. But nevertheless, what is happening at this moment is there is a global connection created by means of the rippling effect of the commodity market shock and the dollar revaluation, which is affecting every fragile country in the world. It is also, as was remarked earlier on, triggering the most dramatic, coordinated contraction in monetary policy and tightening of monetary conditions that we have seen in half a century, if not more. It is absolutely dramatic in scale, especially because in many countries it's associated, notably in the United States, also with a fiscal squeeze. America's fiscal stance right now implies a 4.5% of GDP drag on American growth. It's contractionary by 4.5% of GDP. That's huge. Again, unprecedented. We are witnessing in the current moment the austerity, if you like, tightening that many people feared in 2020, that happened after the 2008 crisis in 2010, and on cue in 2022 is striking not just individual countries, but the entire world economy at this moment. And it confronts us, and this is now we're going to kind of segue back to the issue of global value chains, with the question of what global trade and what global division of labor will look like in the context of a stagflationary shock of the type that we have not seen in decades. We have not seen this sort of simultaneous tightening across the board in half a century. And it's a global stagflation risk compounded by another unprecedented situation, not now in 50 years, but in a generation, which is extremely serious concern for the macroeconomic balance of China. And that matters because in the last 20 years, no country has been a more significant driver of economic growth than China. As recently as last year in 2020, China was the major driver of global growth. In 2008, China was virtually the only engine of global growth. And now this year, in the second half of this year, really quite fundamental questions are being asked about the viability of significant economic growth in China going forward. And one of the fundamental questions has got to be, and when we talk about globalization and its future, we should strip away euphemism and we should focus, if you like, on the material substance of what globalization has been for the last 25 to 30 years. And that's a story that centers on China. So in the next 5-10 minutes, I want to focus on that China side of this story, because if we're to get beyond generalization about globalization, I think we do need to focus on the big driver. China's growth has been world-changing, and it's tempting, if you come to it from the perspective of globalization and global value chains, to believe that China's growth was fundamentally driven by its integration into the world economy. Now, this is true for a period in the early 2000s to a limited extent. But really, over the long period of China's explosive growth, and certainly since 2008, the dominant force in China's economic growth has been domestic, and it has been basically a process of urbanization, the largest and most rapid process of urbanization humanity has ever seen. 250 to 300 million people moving from the countryside to the cities in the space of a single generation, generating the largest single real estate boom, again, in human history. It's just worth adding that rider to every single part of this Chinese data, because all of it is so gigantic in its scale. It's this sort of data which drives these remarkable conclusions that China, in the 2010s, in the space of 3 years, poured more concrete than the United States in the entire 20th century. We're talking about the single largest material transformation of human circumstances ever witnessed. From a standing start, China in the late 1990s did not have a private real estate market, and now it has this huge roaring engine of economic growth, which transforms the social balance of the world, which transforms the overall pattern, therefore, of global demand, because it is relatively affluent Chinese who can afford their own apartments, which constitute the largest single addition to the global middle class. We're not counting here upper class spending, which would drive America to the top of this league, but if you focus on people counted in a reasonable way as middle class, the Chinese middle class is at this point the largest driver of global economic growth, and with that, also the reconfiguration of global value chains with China as their endpoint rather than China as a contributor. This Chinese economic growth changes the geopolitical balance because it changes the tax base, and the tax base is what funds the Chinese military development. Even if China's military spending is much smaller as a percentage of GDP than America's, it nevertheless produces involuntarily a huge shift in the global balance of power. And it prompted an observer as jaundiced and as limpid-eyed as Larry Summers in December 2018 to ask this question, which I still think remains the fundamental question. Can the US imagine a global system in 2050 in which its economy is half the size of the world's largest? Now, that may turn out to be a period piece. Not that many people would expect China's economy to be twice the size of America's by 2050 anymore, but go with the flow of his argument. Even if we can imagine it, could a political leader acknowledge that reality in a way that permits negotiation over what such a world would look like? Remember the definition of crisis? The notion of crisis is an idea about consciousness, about decision, about our ability to grasp the world. What Summers is saying here is that the success of China's economic growth might explode the capacity of the American political class to acknowledge it. Right? While it might be unacceptable to the US to be surpassed in economic scale, he goes on, does it have the means to stop it? Can the US hold China down without inviting conflict? And the astonishing thing is that since he wrote these lines in December 2018, we have had our answer. America is determined to do precisely that. In 2020, in the high-tech sector, America declared something that is tantamount to economic war on China. I'll say more about that towards the end. We could say more about it in Q&A, but I don't see how else you can interpret the strike against Huawei in 2020. Non-judgmentally, but if you just look at the way in which America moved surgically to strike at every element in its supply chain, how else can you describe the actions that were taken at that moment, other than a kind of economic warfare? Of course, legal means were used, but basically this was a forensic, hard-hitting, on-the-run effort to sabotage what at the time, I believe, was either the third or fourth largest private R&D spender in the entire corporate ecosystem worldwide. So this is no small prey America set itself to crippling. China's growth, to take up another point on your agenda, also has changed everything with regard to climate. The climate problem since 2000 is essentially driven by China's dynamic. It is anachronistic to cling to the vision of the climate problem which describes it essentially as dominated by the United States and Europe. That is the climate politics of the 1990s. The climate politics of the last generation is the climate politics of China leading the ROW category, which is EM Asia. Those are the two drivers of the explosive growth in CO2 emissions since 2000. If ecological historians speak about a great acceleration that starts in 1949, we have lived through a second great acceleration starting in 2000s. And Argentina has, of course, felt it. Brazil has felt it through the extraordinary expansion of agro-industrial industries and the deforestation of the Amazon. But at its core, this is driven by the largest burst of old-school, coal-fueled electricity generation, which has driven China's spectacular economic growth and changed the climate game. But China doesn't just disturb the climate equation. It also, since the 1970s, has been identified as the most likely source for a major infectious disease outbreak, that other facet of the Anthropocene that we have come to confront. Now, this is not conspiratorial talk about the Chinese flu. This follows directly from the logic of the infectious diseases paradigm model, which was coined in the 1970s by students of pandemics, and which focuses on this interaction between the churning disturbance of the natural environment, mutations of a zoonotic type, and then their rapid vectorization and transfer around the global system. And from the 1970s, it was clear that Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta were likely to be one of the most dangerous zones for the mutation of diseases that could rapidly become global pandemics. Remember that this used to be our vision of the nightmarish future. It was bird flu spreading out of the relatively undisciplined chicken farms of South China that was going to cause global catastrophe. This was a prediction that is 50 years old. It's as old as climate change, as a prediction of the destabilization of the natural environment we call the Anthropocene. They go hand in hand. And even though before 2020, very few people could actually think climate change and pandemic risk as two equal facets of the Anthropocene, one, if you like, the grinding attritional struggle of trench warfare, climate, and the other a blitzkrieg, which if you fail to manage it in a matter of days would overwhelm your defenses. If you think these two types of diagnosis of the crises of modernity together, they go hand in hand. They were coined at the same time in the 1970s. And from 2000, it's been clear that China is the great driver of destabilization in the world currently. And it wasn't, of course, bird flu that did blow up, but it was something else. Another point we should make, though, before we get to the pandemic, is that long before COVID struck, it was absolutely evident to every fair-minded observer of the global system, and here again I'll cite Larry Summers as a witness, that we were massively underinvesting in the public health apparatus that was necessary to contain the risks systematically, not accidentally. It's a feature, not a bug, of the global development system that it will generate these risks. And it was clear we were hugely underinvesting in the necessary protective devices. Because it's one thing to, as it were, point the finger at the Chinese for incubating the disease. It's quite another to take responsibility for containing the outbreak when it happens. And that, after all, is in the end our failure everywhere in the West. Striking thing about these tables that were done before 2020 is, as you can see here, where people assume the risk is going to be. The fundamental conceit of this work on pandemic risk before 2020 was, as you can see here, that the risk would be unequally distributed towards low and middle income countries. That, of course, ladies and gentlemen, didn't turn out to be our problem. When COVID hit in 2020, it took out not low-income countries, but the three great hubs of the world economy in sequence: China, Europe, North America, and then Latin America as well, in sequence. It is, and it's worth reminding ourselves of this fact before it slips away into memory, the single biggest shock the world economy has ever suffered in this form. The IMF figures it's in the order of $12 trillion between 2020 and 2021. In the annals of economic history, there has never been a graph like this before. This is global GDP indexed to daily data for lockdowns. That data is telling you that in the second week of April 2020, global GDP, the big thing, the really big aggregate, the $80 trillion aggregate, is down by 20% in a matter of weeks. Even in Argentina's storied history of economic crisis, you have never experienced anything like this. This is like 2001 in warp speed. Imagine all of the contraction of 2001 happening in 3 weeks, and then multiply that out to the entire global economy. This is what the world economy normally looks like, and that's my improvisation of a sketch graph of that collapse. Totally unlike any previous experience. And that is the driver, as we all know, of the shocking dislocation, the unprecedented dislocation of global supply systems that we've seen. This data, in and of itself, shouldn't really exist. This is the New York Fed trying to compile an estimate of supply chain instability. Like, when was the last time a New York central banker gave a damn about how global supply chains operated? Well, from 2020 onwards they do, and they update this on a monthly basis, and you can see what it's doing. But it's crucial, I think, in retrospect, to understand the scale of what happened to us, because we have such capacity to repress. COVID is vastly bigger in its impact on the world economy than Ukraine, an order of magnitude larger, if not more. And it's also, and it can sound heretical to say this, far more immediate, far more lethal, far more dramatic on the world's economy than even the most extreme scenarios in the most dismal accounts of climate change. Until you get out to the 2040s and 50s and all the ice caps have melted and we're in real panic stations, it's not until there that you get anything like what just happened to us. I mean, this is the famous FT graph for mortality. All of you will have tracked it. But this data from Wang et al. In the Lancet in 2022 is the clincher. So we think about 18.2 million people died directly of COVID, not knock-on, 18.12 million people. Let's just visualize that for a second. Imagine a climate-related crisis which killed the entire population of Buenos Aires and much of Rio, and that's what just happened to us. And we're all sitting here as though we're going to just carry on. Just imagine those two entire urban conurbations being taken out by some freakish climate-related accident, and how one would expect that to change global discourse. Now, the analogy is false, right? Because we know if you took those two cities out, it would destroy the national economies, whereas we know that COVID killed overwhelmingly economically unproductive old people, and so that's a fundamental distinction. But nevertheless, just to somehow bring back to consciousness what it means for 20 million people to die, that is what we're talking about. It happened in the space of 2.5 years, and it had this disruptive effect. The only solution to it, as far as we're able anyway, is vaccines, and they utterly relied on global value chains. Both the American and European vaccine production hubs, also, of course, India's, would have been entirely inconceivable without the huge added efficiency provided by global trade. And yet, to reiterate the point, and everyone in the global economic governance can see this, everyone can see that it depends on trade, and trade is the solution by way of the vaccine programs, and vaccines themselves are the only way in which we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, we're doing the best to stabilize the world economy in light of this risk. And yet we all know what happened, which is that in 2021 and 2022, the rich countries of the world signally failed to add the pressure and to drive vaccine production at a rate which would have enabled us to take advantage of trillions of dollars of banknotes lying on the street in terms of rate of return to public investment that were available in that moment. So the point I'm trying to make is that the risk of COVID was clearly defined. We knew where it was going to come from. Even before it struck, we knew that we were underinvesting. Then something happened which in the annals of economic history is going to last forever. And within 6 to 12 months of that happening, we still weren't able to organize ourselves to provide a coherent vaccine-based response. That is the, as it were, sum of our failure that we have to face up to. We're all here because we're part of the safe envelope, but large parts of humanity are not, and we're still riding our luck this fall, and we are not driving global vaccine development at the pace which would allow us to say we did everything necessary to minimize the risk this fall. And then, on top of all of this, the most astonishing failure of all. Beijing, the country, the capital of the country which, after the outbreak in 2020, did most successfully manage it, failed to systematically protect its most vulnerable population. What we know now about the Chinese vaccine program is it went overwhelmingly into the arms of productive middle-aged people and their children, and what they failed to do was to get 3 shots of the Chinese vaccine, which is not good if you just have 1 or 2 shots, but highly effective if you have 3. They failed to get them into the arms of their most vulnerable population. And as a result of that, China is now caught in a zero-COVID trap of its own making. What was a first-best policy, which was turned into a disastrous policy by our own ruinous failure in the West, has now turned into a real trap for the Chinese regime. So the situation that we're in at this moment is one in which China, the hub, the driver, materially the fundamental force that has driven globalization in the last 30 years, is facing a triple risk: a deflating housing bubble, a zero-COVID lockdown policy impasse, and an economic war with the West. And what that means for the world economy is the bleakest piece of bad news that we could possibly have. If you want to make an estimate of the likelihood and the development of world trade from the second half of this year onwards, there's no more important factor than the way in which these 3 variables play out in China. This sort of headline, China's low-growth, zero-COVID policy signals transition away from the reform period, is, to my mind, and I think will go down in history, as the most significant break in the regime that we're experiencing. Or will it be this, which is the question of whether anyone in the West really should shed any tears over this? Is this thinking about China as a growth engine increasingly out of date? At a time when Western strategists are actively contemplating war with China as a real prospect, the entire American security establishment thinks of very little else other than the risks of war with China, how to win a war with China. That is what they are tasked with doing. These are soldiers, that is their job. But that is what they're doing to an extraordinarily literal extent. Rand is now gaming different strategies for long or short wars against China. What does it mean in a context like that to actually consider the question of whether we want to see Chinese economic growth continuing? And as far as global value chains are concerned, I've already said to you that it's far from obvious that powerful interests in the West any longer are interested in giving a positive answer to that question. In fact, as far as the Pentagon, National Security Establishment, Commerce Department of the United States are concerned, they are on the record explicitly saying that no, they want to draw a line above which China's tech development is not to go. They want to uncouple GDP growth for China, maybe from the leading edge of its technological development. And not only that, as you all know, every single major player in the global system is currently turning the most sophisticated arena of global value chains and global manufacturing, the microchip area, into a battleground of competitive industrial policy, the likes of which we have, I think, probably never ever seen. On the scale at which spending is being undertaken by every single major player in the global system and the technological ambition, what we're talking about here are chips that are architected at a scale which is half the size of the COVID virus. A 5 nanometer chip is etched at half the scale of a COVID virus. So this is a human-made artifact which we mass manufacture, which is half the scale of a COVID virus. Perhaps unsurprisingly, very few humans are capable of doing this, and they are all in harm's way. In other words, they're all in South Korea and Taiwan. That's where that capacity lies. It's not obvious that however much money you spend, you'll ever be able to do it in Ohio on scale. But that's what the project that we embarked on attempting to do. It's a huge challenge, but is one in which at least the West, and the West in the broadest sense, has allies. The question of, however, whether the United States can build a powerful technological bloc around this, I think, is an open question, because the offer that China is making to its America is making to its East Asian partners is, I think, in many ways as ambiguous as the American offer to its European partners in the confrontation with Russia. America has an anti-Chinese game plan. It's not obvious to me that it has an East Asia stability and economic prosperity plan. And squaring the two things together is extremely difficult. And that's the easy bit. Microchips is the technology where at least the West has, as it were, a technological lead. If you come to the other area of large-scale industrial policy in the current moment, we're talking about going uphill in the most extreme fashion. The transition from internal combustion engines to EV is clearly the great industrial, if you like, a large-scale, heavy industrial project of our current generation. Cars drove global value chains. This is a huge transition that we're undertaking, and in every single dimension of this industry, China already has a dominant position, literally every single one. And there is no significant European player that had any vision for an EV transition which didn't include China, with the lead being VW. Who's explicit in its idea that its EV strategy is coupled to China. So there's a deep contradiction here. It's not simply the technological obstacle of microchips, but here there's a really deep contradiction. Auto industry is key to the global value chain story all the way back to the 1970s. The EV transition is core to the green industrial policies of both Europe and the United States, but in the actually existing EV sector, it is virtually unimaginable to envision a future without China. And how is this going to be squared? So if you look at something like America's Inflation Reduction Act, the much ballyhooed climate legislation which the Biden administration has just astonishingly, dizzyingly managed to pass, if you look into the detail, it includes some really sobering dimensions. So to get the $7,500 tax credit, $7,500 tax credit, which this package promises, you actually have to meet extremely demanding requirements over the medium term for where you source your lithium and cobalt, where you get your batteries from. The current IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is not just a piece of climate legislation. It was architected in Congress to be essentially a national industrial economic development program. And here too, the jury is out as to whether or not that can actually be done. How realistic is the green agenda, to wrap things up? How realistic is the green agenda is one of the core questions that you wanted to confront me with. And I think here it seems to me that there are two different angles on this question, both of them perfectly legitimate but quite distinct. If you come at the green agenda from the perspective of climate politics, I think the answer has got to be largely pessimistic and negative. Is anything that has currently been agreed anywhere in the world adequate to get us to climate stabilization by 2050? The answer is clearly no. If that's your metric, the answer is that this isn't for real, it's not very serious, it's not necessary, it's clearly not going to get us to where we need to go. If, however, you're not fundamentally centered on the question of climate effects, but you're interested in the impact on key industries around the world of these partial and incomplete efforts to be seen to be doing something, then I think the answer is emphatically yes, it's going to be transformative. In at least two sectors, which is power generation and land mobility, in other words, cars, trucks, and so on. Potentially also with regard to domestic heating and cooling. Enough is already in the works now in North America, China, and Europe to be able to reliably predict so much. If you add these two things together, however, and I think it will be surprising if out of the current confrontation with Russia, we do not get a concerted push by the Europeans towards greater energy autonomy. So I think there is real emphasis here. But we also have to ask ourselves a further question, right? Which if both of these things are true, in other words, there will not be enough movement to fix and stabilize the climate problem, but there will be enough movement to change industrial structures in certain sectors, what is the resultant of those two vectors? And it seems to me that we could be looking at three potential outcomes from that. Because clearly we're going to be faced with more and more serious climate crises. We're going to be faced with more and more serious climate crises. So we could double down on mitigation in a crash form 15 to 20 years from now. We could be looking for silver bullet solutions 15 to 20 years from now, some crash program for carbon capture. We're not serious about it yet. We're not spending the money. But if we get to the point, we may have to. And the third option, of course, is we simply abandon mitigation and go for adaptation, which may be part of the portfolio of measures that we need to take. In any case, a realistic assessment of the impact of climate politics on global industrial policy, I think, requires us to consider all three of these options. There will be change. Will it be enough? Almost certainly no. So therefore, what follows in the next round? And to really wrap things up and to conclude my long-winded comments this afternoon, The most important thing to realize is that this is not going to be a decision made in the West, even in the West in the most broad sense. The climate problem, the climate political economy, the political economy of the energy transition that matters over the next 30 years is not principally going to be driven by decisions made in the United States, in Europe, or anywhere else in the broader world, in the West. We can make progress on technological solutions. We can create coalitions of climate capital. We can spawn technological coalitions. But the work needs to be done in the place where the global growth is actually generating the huge surge in emissions, which I alluded to early on. And this is the same graph as you saw early on, but now stacked. And it brings home just how dramatic this is. The climate problem is fundamentally an Asian problem in the next generation. It is there that the impact will be most severe, as we've already seen in the heat wave in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh this year. And it is there in the centers of the world economy, which are growing rapidly, because as we all know, it essentially follows, sorry, I lost my track in my, oopsie. No, please. There we are. Yeah. So this logic follows basically from this very simple equation of population, GDP per capita, and environmental intensity, right? That it is in Asia that we have the population, the mass of population. It's in Asia that we have the mass of the growth in GDP per capita. It's in Asia that we have the environmental intensity of units of GDP still at very high levels because we're heavily fossil fuel dependent. And that is where the entire politics of climate and energy transition really is going to be focused. We should be clear about the sense in which, at this point, our destiny no longer lies in our own hands. If there is one dimension of human experience and human history in which the baton has already fundamentally passed from the West to Asia, it is climate politics. That is the space in which the overtaking by China has already fundamentally happened. China today emits more CO2 than the entire Western world, the entire OECD put together. Europe, the United States, Japan, all stacked on top of each other, emit less CO2 than China. It is the driver of the entire problem. And that goes back to the story that concerns you most here, which is globalization and value chains. Because what drives this growth of emissions in China over the last 30 years is the mobilization of the Asian labor force, this spectacular surge in hundreds of millions of workers that were bolted into the global value chain progress. It is the environmental counterpart to the incorporation of Chinese labor into global production systems with the backing of massive amounts of fossil fuel that create this huge shift in the global environmental problem. The triumph of globalization over the last 30 years is that 1.5 billion workers in Asia and the former communist bloc were integrated into the global value chains. They were integrated as productive by way of mobilizing energy. This is what produces the climate shock. Their CO2 consumption surges and shifts the entire balance. That's what we're wrestling with. So the environmental problem, the global climate problem, the global value chains problem are essentially the same problem, but now will have to be addressed. But if that is the case, then one further question is begged, which is literally the last point that I will leave you with this afternoon, which is what is the future of this development? Because the fundamental driver of economic growth at the global level since the 1970s has been the adjustment of economic activity, and thus energy intensity and just CO2, to population, to where the population was. We overcame the bizarre situation of the 1970s, where China and India barely figured in the global balance, 1 or 2% of the share of global GDP, because their output was so low. Economic activity shifted to where the population is. But we are, ladies and gentlemen, on the cusp of another, in some ways, far more dramatic shift in the global demographic balance over the coming decades. Something truly unprecedented is about to happen, and that is the emergence of Africa as the driver of global demographic dynamism. The story of Asia is, in a sense, after all, a story of a return back to a familiar pattern in which Asia was the center of the world economy. That is the story of the world economy up to the 18th century, throughout history up to that point. Never before in history have we seen an African continent densely populated. It's a completely new thing under the sun. It is not something for which we have any track record, any experience, any path dependent history that we can draw on to explain this. And so there are really starkly divergent, fundamentally different futures ahead of us, which are basically driven by the question of whether or not this huge surge, as you can see here, by 2050, the African workforce will outnumber the entire global workforce outside Asia. Will be in Africa. The African workforce will outnumber all of the non-Asian workers in the world. The question is whether that group of people can be incorporated into global production or not, and on what terms they will. And whatever answer we give to that question, the result will be a further dramatic shift, every bit as dramatic as the one that we have lived through in the last 30 years. If it's a story of inclusion, incorporation, it will be a driver of absolutely massive growth. If we cannot find renewable energy sources to sustain it, it will totally tip the environmental balance. But if we don't incorporate, the consequences are in some senses even more spectacular, even more problematic, even more dark, in the sense that we will be talking about a society like Nigeria with a population by that point of 400 to 500 million people with no prospect of economic development. And that will pose that fundamental question of the limits of liberalism, which is how far we are willing to build fortresses to defend our affluence against the desperation of a continent that needs work for its young population. In any case, we are entering fascinating times. Thank you very much for your patience. I look forward to the discussion later.
Agradecemos al Dr. Tooze por su exposición. Recordamos a los asistentes por streaming al seminario que deseen participar de la ronda de preguntas y respuestas, que podrán hacerlo enviando sus preguntas a través del formulario que encontrarán en la página. Y ahora los invitamos a pasar a un pequeño break de algunos minutos y nos reencontramos aquí para continuar con la segunda parte de la presentación. Gracias. La siguiente exposición sobre el tema desafíos y oportunidades para las cadenas globales de valor estará a cargo del Dr. Timothy Sturgeon, investigador senior del Industrial Performance Center, MIT, experto en el estudio de los procesos de integración global y transformación digital, con énfasis en las prácticas de offshoring y outsourcing en las actividades de las industrias electrónicas, automotriz y de servicios industriales. El Dr. Sturgeon ha realizado numerosas y destacadas publicaciones en el área de las cadenas globales de valor. Dr. Sturgeon, lo escuchamos.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to follow on the tough act of following Adam's talk. And I will say that it was very inspiring and I learned a lot. I think that what I'm going to do is in a sense similar but much more focused on one thing, which is this. So, but this is a microcosm really of many of the things that Adam was talking about. And I'm going to try to focus on the policy piece of it at the end. I just have to say that, you know, what I'm going to say today is my own opinions, not MIT, or we have a colleague at the World Bank. None of those are speaking today. And even my colleagues who have worked with me for years on this project are off the hook because we have not published this yet. So we're still arguing over various items and messages that we want to take from this research. But our paper will be out shortly in the World Bank Policy Research Working Paper Series. And I hope I can get you all a copy. So what are we arguing from in our paper? We've developed a concept called a massively modular ecosystem. It's kind of the moving from global value chains to ecosystems, but looking at kind of hugely globally interconnected ecosystems. So the argument really is that digitization is really behind the transformation of both the organization of industries and therefore the geography of industries. So globalization is underneath that. So because once you digitize information, It can be generated, stored, transmitted, analyzed, and processed in new ways. This has been going on for a very long time. But when you have standard interfaces between one bundle of digitized information and another, you can build products in a modular fashion with immense complexity and scale. So on the organization side, you see these huge global ecosystems that make these products, like this one. And with some engineering effort, because this is not a market, right? This is a modular connection of very complex things. So there's always exceptions. There's always kind of blowback, things that don't work, engineers getting on airplanes and working out problems. So that's the modular piece. I'm not running. Okay. No wonder. Okay. This is what I just said. So you can see products with immense complexity, and I'll talk about how complex a smartphone is, but at scale. So this kind of type of an economic structure that I'm talking about has kind of three built-in paradoxes. One is that you can make things of immense complexity at scale. If you look at theories looking at kind of complex systems, the most complex systems are normally produced in small volumes, either customized or in kind of very small runs. Things like aircraft carriers. You know, you don't make them in the millions or billions of units. With smartphones, you actually do, and the complexity is about at that level. To accomplish that, you have market concentration in different parts of the system. So you see Samsung, Apple, Google, Southern China as a manufacturing center, all kind of taking a piece of this ecosystem. So you have market concentration in the companies in those places, but also because the whole system is made up of different players, the whole system is not run by one big company. And I think that we get a little bit distracted by the fact that there are hugely powerful companies like Facebook, like Apple, like Google, that are running so much of these ecosystems that we say, well, you know, this is a monopoly. But if you look underneath, behind the curtain, there's other huge players there, and they're also in different places. So if you figure out, you know, what type of milieu makes those types of players possible, it's usually in kind of geographic clusters. You know, places where there's lots of companies or lots of capabilities around a certain set of technologies or business models or whatever it is. But because there's so many of them in different places, the whole system is dispersed. And there's another piece to that, which is platforms that kind of invites complements, and I'll talk more about that later, but that has another kind of a piece of this dispersal dynamic. So what I really want to get to, though, is the policy piece. So because of these three dynamics, complexity, scale, you know, leads to the market concentration and fragmentation I talked about. But because these pieces of these systems are in different jurisdictions, this creates the pressure for decoupling and the end of globalization that Adam was talking about, right? If you have essential components being made in another country, and you're in country, you're in country A, and some things are being in country B, you feel that you could be, you know, held hostage if that part of the supply chain went away. So that creates this pressure for decoupling. And import substitution and indigenous innovation, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever it is. So this pressure. The opposite side of it, though, of this policy paradox, of is kind of where I'm landing, is that because these pieces are really not replicable or substitutable in any kind of reasonable way, it forces the players and the policymakers, the nation states, it will force them to make accommodations for ongoing sustainable interdependence. And so this is kind of also the choices and the tension that Adam was talking about. So we're talking about just in handsets, this playing out. So thank you for warming up. So we're warming this up. But I guess I could just stop right there. I mean, that's the argument, okay? But I'm an academic, so I'm going to make this way more complicated. Thank you. You're welcome. And show evidence for all of these things. But keep in mind, this is kind of the idea. So if you think about an industry value chain or a set of players as an ecosystem, let's say mobile telecom is an ecosystem with a bunch of systems, end products that are collected into an industry ecosystem with subsystems and components feeding into that. Very simple. But with platforms, and I'll talk more about that, there's a two-sided platform where the module, the phone itself, for example, you can run apps off of it. So there's lots of complementers increasing the value of the phone, but because you can have so many things happening on the phone. But it turns out that many of the components down the chain are also platforms. All the way down to, at the very end, a component at the very bottom might be some software, some code that is used to design microchips. From a company like ARM, is a UK company that has the architecture for the CPU for almost all the phones, no matter who makes them. But ARM has an army of complementers, of companies making tools and software to help other companies design chips based on the ARM architecture. So there are these ecosystems, but they're not alone. They're connected to other ecosystems. So here's another ecosystem that might be cloud computing. Same thing, a whole range of inputs to that. And I just want to point out that there's some connections. You might have AI code that is used both in smartphones and in inside of cloud computing systems. So this yellow kind of modular connection is showing the connection, a very simple one connection between these two ecosystems. So how does that work? Why are they these fat lines? And this is because this is a modular linkage. Inside of each of these modules, there's a lot of engineering going on, a lot of people sitting around tables working out these problems. But Carlos Baldwin would say there's thin crossing points where you simplify the link between these modules into some type of interface standard that allows you to hand off all that complex stuff to another player in the value chain or in the ecosystem, and they know they can then use it to build their bigger system. That's the modular piece. So how does that work? Well, each of these kind of interfaces has a standard that goes along with it. So there's industry standards, and then there's also standards that are kind of not just in the industry, but they're used in many industries. If you think about something like, Linux or so many different things that are, even Android is not just used in a phone. Android is an operating system that runs many, many consumer electronics and home goods and other things like that. So there's things that cross over. So we spend some time in this paper kind of talking about different kinds of standards. So we have this kind of, this 2x2 chart. And I'll just I don't want to spend too much time on this. Most of the discussion is around this top monopolistic standards, de facto standards and de jure standards. The de facto side are kind of winners of standards battles. So Google with Android has a de facto standard for a big chunk of the mobile phone industry. And people are really interested in that because it gives them a huge amount of power and generates a lot of revenue. Then there's kind of government standards. This is, we're going to write a rule that you have to follow. So most of the focus is there. But what I want to really kind of point out, and we spend some time, is that everything else here is a lot more, is not nearly as, is much more egalitarian and kind of non-competitive, pre-competitive. There are standards, I guess with this SSO, things like 3GPP that makes the 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, these are kind of huge numbers of engineers putting suggestions in, and they debate, and it's a very democratic, from all over the world. They have to have 75% of the engineers have to say, yes, we accept your you know, so stunning that this actually works. It's all private sector, right? Yeah, so this is happening underneath everything, right? It's kind of shocking. But there are big players that want their code in because they can have what they call standard essential patents that they can get revenue for licensing. So big players like Nokia and Ericsson and Qualcomm fight hard to get their technology in, and they've already won the battle in 3G. So in 4G and 5G, it's easier for them to kind of to continue on. But I'll talk more about that. But in the ICT industry is just rife with these things. So 43% of all the standards issued by U.S. agencies or an ICT, a personal computer is running on, you know, depending on what generation it is, between 250 and 500 standards are inside the PC to make it work. So standards are important. And people spend a lot of time into who's going to win the platform wars. How do you become a dominant platform player? But there's all of this other stuff running underneath that actually makes it work. So when I do my research, and I'm interested in this stuff, I want to know about, you know, when you design a circuit board, how do you hand that off to a company that makes a circuit board? They say, oh, there's this thing called a Gerber file. Everybody, it's like, where's that come from? I don't know. Nobody cares. It's just like water, like the fish is swimming in. But it's really important, and we find it very interesting. So why is modularity important? So it kind of allows this kind of this first paradox of complexity at scale. So with modular coordination, you have this formalized codified interface between modules that allows both scale and complexity. On the other side, you can have all of that inside the same company. You can have but that's going to limit the scale to whatever that product that company makes, right? Or you can have relational ties between companies or between agents in the ecosystem where you sit down and actually work these things out. But that's not scalable, right? You can't really kind of blow that up into something that grows very quickly. What you can scale is a simple market transaction, but that doesn't really hold up to the complexity needs of modern products. The one point is that the relational linkages are there. They're super important for innovation, because this is where innovation happens, when people sit around a table and they work together closely, either inside the same company or across. So this is not all modular. The relational piece is there. I'll come back to that. But the combination of complexity at scale in the middle here it's paradoxical force. So let's go to the three paradoxes. And actually, in Adam's presentation, he gave me about 6 more. There are all these things that kind of go cut both ways, right? So so that we have complexity at scale, the market concentration, and I won't go through all this; it'll just take too long, and geographic clustering and dispersion. So all of these things are present, and you know I've wrestled with this for a long time, particularly as a geographer, looking at global value chains. I didn't even know how to talk about it for years. It's like, well, there's a clusters, but it's, you know, so globalization doesn't mean that the pieces of the value chain are going everywhere. They only go to they're collecting in these clusters. So it's both clustering and dispersed. So what we did with this paper is we just embraced the kind of the paradox of that, and then once we did that, there was kind of paradoxes everywhere, which Adam's way ahead on. So I'll kind of go into that in more detail. So what about this is my colleague, he gives this presentation, he says, think about all the things you've done on your phone in the last 24 hours, which is provocative, but, or don't think about it, but there's a lot of different things, right? There's the flashlight. I love that. It's a flashlight. Who knew? It wasn't always like that. So back in 2003, this is the most popular phone. And I'm sure all of us are probably, almost all of us can remember having these candy bar phones. But it's a monochrome display. There's 50 people in the phone book, 10 last calls dialed and received and missed, no camera, no speaker, you know, no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no GPS, no, you know, USBs. The games were Snake 2 and Space Impact. Yeah, so things have changed a lot. They've changed because this complexity and the capabilities have increased because of modularity. Here with the Nokia, I think it's a 6360, it's a closed platform. So the hardware and the operating system for this Nokia phone were made by Nokia. Only the apps that were designed for that operating system could run on the phone, and there are very, very few of them. So there's high levels of vertical integration, and when the suppliers that Nokia was using, like Texas Instruments, had a very kind of close connection, and that CPU was not easily adaptable to any other phone. So really there was no modular interface. The iPhone, the first iPhone in 2007, and if you have a chance, you should go back and look at the YouTube video of Steve Jobs introducing the first iPhone. And he was so happy because he really had something that he had a feeling it was going to change all of our lives, and for better or for worse, it has. But it was a closed platform where the hardware and the OS, again, were designed by Apple. There's an open platform. In other words, you can put apps up on their store through this application programming interface, which is exactly one of these modular interfaces I'm talking about. They say, here's a spec. You can build whatever app you want. You can do whatever, take advantage of all the capabilities of the phone, but it has to talk to the phone and according to the API. Okay? When Android came in a year later, it was an interesting model. It's a partially open source. They're building off of Linux, the operating system. They take open source contributions, but it's not fully open. Google decides what the release is going to be. But they're constantly collecting open source contributions from engineers all over the world for the next generation. And they kind of work that out, and they take those contributions and they kind of test out the next generation. But once it's released, it's frozen, and they decide on that. And there's an open platform, and they have their own API for apps. So anyway, you're all familiar with this. Well, what did this do to the industry? So here is the OS, the operating system market share from 2012, you know, back in the day, so long ago, where there was a bunch of phone makers that are gone. BlackBerry, Symbian, which was running on some Samsung phones, and Nokia. And you can just see Apple and then Android completely pushing them out of the market in a very short period of time. You know, by 2014, it was game over. So here's a diagram of what we think this ecosystem looks like in a very simple way. So you got the handset, and then the operating system is connected to that with this modular interface. That talks to the network with the front end module, which is on the orange box, which is the radio module. So that's kind of looking at the radio signals. But you know, this phone can talk to about 8 different frequencies at the same time. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, but we'll talk more about that. So those standards are set up through this standard setting process to the network, so it can connect to the different network providers. Now, the phones themselves are made by contract manufacturers like Foxconn in China and other places. There are requirements. I mean, I talked about Gerber, the Gerber file. Well, that's a lot of how the circuit board is laid out is contained in that Gerber file. So there's a modular connection there to the contract manufacturers, so they can work for Apple, they can work for Huawei, they can work for for a lot of different companies in different industries using those standards. Then there's a bunch of kind of non-platform components of subsystems like memory, all the blue boxes, memory, displays, a whole bunch of kind of more or less just complex components that can be used in the phone. Then there's all of these additional wireless features, Wi-Fi, GPS chips, and they all have published standards, and they have standard setting bodies that kind of say, well, what the next generation of Wi-Fi version, this, that, and the other thing is going to be. Same with GPS, near field, which gives you mobile payments and all these other things. Then there's the CPU itself. Up to 20 billion transistors in each of the CPUs, designed with electronic design tools that are industry standard, and then the semiconductor companies, the foundries have to make them. So especially with CPUs, the companies that are designing the CPUs are not the companies that make the CPUs. So the actual production in the foundries is done a lot in Taiwan. Almost like 80% of complex semiconductors like that are made in Taiwan. And again, as I said before, running the architecture of that chip is these IP blocks, the intellectual property code coming from ARM. And they have their third-party complementers. So there's a bunch of key components. Many of them are platforms with complementers. So it kind of spreads out this ecosystem in many, many directions. And then the other piece of it is that each of these ecosystems are connected to other parts and other industries. So these contract manufacturers up in the upper left, they make computers, industrial electronics, medical electronics, consumer electronics. They make a whole range of things, military, et cetera, using the same Gerber file, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these are connected to adjacent parts of the ICT industry. So this is really the massive part of it. So complexity. I won't go through all of this. These are kind of key functions on the phone and how they've changed over time from 2009 to 2020. The compound annual growth rate of the clock speed of the processor, how many processors. So there used to be one microprocessor. Now these big CPUs have 8, 9, 12 CPUs kind of packed onto one chip. So the average in this data set that we scraped with over 15,000 phones, the average in 2009 was 1 processor. The average in 2020 was 8 processors on each phone. So it just goes on like that down the line. How much memory? What's the resolution of the displays? How many pixels, et cetera? If you add up all of this functional improvement over this 10-year period, essentially, that the compound annual rate of change is 20% per year. So that's when you get into aircraft carrier level complexity. So what about scale? So you have these incredibly complex things that are getting more complex over time. So what about scale? So if you look at the kind of the market growth, the blue line are the smartphones, the touchscreen smartphones. The red line is the feature phones, the simple candy bar ones. Didn't do so well. There's still a lot made, but the sales of smartphones peaked in 2018 at 1.6 billion units shipped that year. So that's a lot. Alongside of that is, that's a big number of anything, is the number of apps that run and particularly on Android. That also peaked in pretty much the same year, 3.6 million available apps for Android. So, market concentration. We're still in the operating system world. So this is Android. These are the open source contributions. We scraped the website the Android open source project has folders with all of the contributions that engineers are saying to Google, here's how I think you should solve this problem or that problem. So we figured out which companies they were attached to and then use the nationality of the company, right? Not the location of the engineer, the nationality of the company, which is important. Because in studying global value chains, it was always a problem, like we don't really know where things are made, right? Because it's probably a bunch of these folks are in India or somewhere else or in somebody's garage somewhere. So we don't know where they are, but we do know more or less what companies they're working for. And why is that important? Now it's important because the jurisdiction of ownership is what exposes companies to this geopolitical pressure that we want to talk about. So companies, in the neoliberal period said, well, we're a global company, right? We're Qualcomm. We have customers all over the world. We have operations all over the world. We're a global company. But when the U.S. Department of Commerce said you may not ship Qualcomm semiconductors to ZTE or to Huawei, they suddenly were an American company. Whoops. So we work all of this through the ownership, the geography of the ownership of the company. So for looking at Android commits over, this is 10 million commits. In other words, how many of these codes were actually used since 2008? That's like the beginning of Android. So 10 million of these pieces of code that were emailed in by engineers. Other companies in the USA, 32%. Google itself, 23%. Virtual, these are kind of organizations like Linux that don't really, we don't know where they are. And European companies, 10%. China, 0.4%. So China's not working in this, is not helping to build Android. Chinese engineers at Chinese companies are not helping to build Android. I wanted to point that out. But very, very kind of concentrated in Google and very, very concentrated in the United States. The apps, here's the fragmentation side. The apps are made all over the place. And non-OECD countries, so the developing world, if you want to put it that way, I don't, because that seems aspirational. It's a good showing. So China, Brazil, Russia, India are all kind of where the folks who are making the apps that run on Android are located in these countries. At least they were in 2017. Not a lot of data on this, unfortunately. So, market fragmentation. If you look, so this is different than the operating system, except for, the red line, I'm sorry. The blue line, the blue bars at the bottom is Apple. So they're running their own operating system. Everybody else is running Android. And Samsung is a big player there in the red bar. But everything up on top of that is tons of other companies, hundreds of handset makers, lots of them in small companies and big companies in China. So here's Huawei in the purple line. And that line is going to be shrinking in the next couple of years, maybe down to nothing. But lots of other major Chinese companies, Xiaomi, the Vivo and Oppos of the world. And then this other category, this kind of gray line at the top. Who cares about them? Well, these are companies that are able to design phones that are not as complicated as this iPhone, but still are incredibly complicated, even from a phone 2 years ago. And they're able to build this. Dozens and dozens and hundreds of companies are able to do this because of the modularity. So the barriers to entry to make these incredibly complex products are relatively low because they can buy these super complex components and subsystems and plug them together using the architecture of an ARM and make usable, really nice, actually, only a few years behind or months, the leading edge. So that's the market fragmentation. But you can see that Samsung and Apple are still huge players. So there's some concentration there, but there's some fragmentation. So let's go into the subsystems. So these are if you look at the very bottom, we're just looking at the kind of key subsystems: the displays, CPUs, the memory, so the core memory. This is not the memory that's in the CPU, but the actual how much memory your phone has. There's a memory chip there, and network connectivity. This is the red box I showed you before that talks to the network. That's a special front-end module. So we have a data set of 456 handsets that were torn down by consulting companies. They opened them up, and they figure out, they look at every single component, and they write down what it says on it, and we can figure out, for a lot of them, particularly the most expensive components, who made it, I mean, what brand it is. Is it Hitachi, right, or is it Qualcomm, or Texas Instruments, or who is it, right? So we were able to kind of look at the kind of in this basket of phones, which is a little bit tilted towards the high end, because these consulting companies don't tear down every phone. They tear down the phones that people are interested in, which is a lot of the high-end phones, but also middle-range phones. There's a lot of phones, middle-range phones in there. So they're tearing down about 38 per year. So we're able to look at all the components, and there's about between 800 and 1,500 individual components inside of a phone. And the ones that had identifying markings figure out which country, which company, and therefore which country, and I'll look at that in a minute, the country side. But this is just how concentrated are these markets. And you can see on the top line that this Herfindahl index of concentration is going up for each of these subsystems. So over time, there's fewer players making each of these types of core components. And then you can the bottom is just the number of suppliers. So you go from network connectivity, 20 companies selling these front-end modules, down to like 12, et cetera. So there's a rising market concentration. And then you can just look at the top, 0.25, the U.S. Justice Department would say that's a highly concentrated market. Watch out. So almost all of this is way above that. So these are each concentrated. But the other piece of it is that you can't make a phone, anything out of any one of these things. They have to work together. So the whole system isn't concentrated, but within each component it is. So let's look at the geography of this. So let's take those companies and turn them into countries by, again, looking at headquarters. And then, so we have data, we just looked at data from 2010 to 2019. So for the display, 54% of the displays in 2010 were made by Korean firms. By 2019, 81%. So that's mostly Samsung. The CPU, about 3/4 are made by U.S. companies. So the U.S. dominates in CPU design, not the making of the chip, but the design of the chip. So most of that is Qualcomm. Memory, again, Korea. Network connectivity is a little more spread out, but U.S. companies like Broadcom, et cetera, kind of are very powerful, and that's increased in concentration. And then this other wireless is a funny category because it's a lot of different things. So it doesn't really make sense. I didn't show it in the market concentration because it's not one market. But U.S. companies actually have lost market share, and Japanese companies like Murata have increased their market share. But this is all kind of out of 100% for each one. There's not much money in this other wireless. The other thing is that this process called encapsulation, where the CPU kind of starts absorbing more and more of these functions, right? You go from 10 billion transistors to 20 billion transistors. What are they doing? There's maybe many cores, but they're running the GPS on there. They're running the Wi-Fi on there. So some of these things are disappearing and kind of getting absorbed into the CPU. So that's kind of interesting to us kind of nerds. So let's look again now at the whole semiconductor stack. So this is important for what we were talking about before with the policies to underwrite kind of chip manufacturing. But this is the entire stack. So the wafer fabrication, what Adam was talking about, what I'll talk about later, is down here. This is wafer fabrication here, okay? So these are both companies that make their own chips and outsource it to foundries. You can see Taiwan is, of all of that, 20% of all semiconductor fabrication is done by Taiwanese companies, basically two companies in Taiwan, TSMC and UMC. And so that's what all these policies are trying to get a piece of. Look at the rest of it, though. There's the design software and the core IP, design tools. 74% U.S. companies, Cadence, Synoptics. the CPU design itself, we were just talking about it, and this is all semiconductors, this is not just for phones. 67% US companies, Intel, Qualcomm. And then, you know, you have a company like MediaTek out of Taiwan, and there's a few players. Then there's the simple stuff that just do one thing. Those are kind of scattered everywhere. Memory, okay, we already talked about it. South Korea, 59%. The production equipment, how do you make these semiconductors? You know, ASML is a Dutch company. Applied Materials is from Silicon Valley. There's Japan. There's a couple of really important companies in Japan. There's a German company, Zeiss, that makes the lens. They can only do about 50 a year. That are so difficult to make that you have these like German operators like polishing these lenses to incredible accuracy to make these little tiny features on the chips, right? You have to kind of have accuracy. So then there's assembly and test. So the light blue box is China. So where does China even show up here? Assembly and packaging. So this is, you take the little chip and you put it in a box and put some epoxy in it, and that's, you know, it's all pretty much automated. The wafer fabrication is growing. This is what China is really aggressively going into. And then the materials, the gases, and other things, I mean, China is there as well. But overall, if you add it all up, you know, China consumes 24% of all semiconductors in the world and adds about 9% of the value. So there's a mismatch here between value added and consumption that really bothers them. They said, this is not fair. You know, we're buying all these semiconductors, we're not adding much value, we have to change this. So there's been a long history of techno-nationalist push in China to try to remedy this situation. And I won't walk all, I think people are familiar with a lot of this. China 2025, and one of the things they talked about is they want to have 70%, they wanted to have 70% self-sufficiency, not just in semiconductors by 2025. Well, that's not looking like that's going to happen. So it's very difficult. They're trying to reverse engineer. They realize, oh, it's not just we can buy all these equipment from Japanese and Dutch and US companies, but actually it's really hard to make these chips, even with this. You know, so this has been great for these equipment companies and the folks who build the buildings, engineers from other countries mostly, building these incredibly complex buildings to make chips in. Clean rooms, water handling, air handling systems that are incredible. That's one of the most complex things in a semiconductor plant is actually the building. But anyway, so that's great for those companies, but they actually haven't been able to really make chips very well, even with all that investment. So that's not working out so well. I thought what was interesting is very recently they realized that the standards are important and that the whole world is running on this kind of standard system that I talked about. So there's a new initiative, the China Standards 2035 initiative, which is, you know, the US is looking at that and said, well, we're going to work with our Quad partners to kind of on our own standards. So you have this kind of idea that this standardization system, and the Belt and Road is also a lot about developing a set of China standards around a lot of different things. So there's this pressure for decoupling not only in manufacturing or technology, but in the standards that make those things happen. And what nobody has seemed to have grasped yet is a lot of this happens with open source. This kind of hacker, you know, Linux type of mentality where we're just going to like put code in because I'm a good engineer and I want people to use my code, and I can put on my resume that X many people are using my code. And a lot of stuff happens on open source, and it's completely unregulated. It's completely outside of any kind of trade restriction. So that flow of IP is happening under the radar, so to speak. But all of the other pieces, have been manipulated by various kinds of regulation in these trade wars to try to put pressure on China, but also now on Russia. So if you look at Huawei, the red line is actually using their own. We're back to mobile phones. Huawei has its own in-house design called high silicon, and they have their chips, their advanced chips made in Taiwan. But you can see that the blue line, Qualcomm, a U.S. company, going down in all of these. This is the basket of Huawei phones that we had. You can see Huawei going away and high silicon coming in. So they're really trying to replace this imported technology with their own technology. But these run but the high silicon chips, they run ARM too, just like everybody else. Oops. So, participation in these massively modular ecosystems, there's been huge benefits. There's ability to scale, to develop specialized kind of capabilities in the network and kind of grow those into global markets. And the whole system has been innovating at incredible rates, right? 20% a year improvement in functionality. There's multiple ways to capture value in this system. There's not one big dog that runs and captures all the value. Some big dogs capture a lot of value, like Apple or Google, but there's many ways to make money in that system. But there's vulnerabilities, right? So especially for Chinese companies that don't have a lot of presence in the core technologies. So one story was that here in 2018, the Commerce Department slapped sanctions on ZTE, which is another Chinese, actually very close to the Chinese government, mobile equipment company and handsets. They were selling equipment violating sanctions to Iran and North Korea. They were going through shell companies and selling equipment to those companies. So this Commerce Department slapped a sanction on them. They literally shut down their factories the next day. Because we looked at their phones, and 95% of their CPUs were coming from Qualcomm. They were spending $1 billion for those a year with Qualcomm. So, Chinese companies are feeling vulnerable. China is feeling vulnerable to this. But what does China have to offer? I mean, what does China have that no one else has? Well, one thing they have, among other things, a huge market, is export manufacturing, particularly in southern China, around Guangdong. So 76.4% of production is coming out of China, particularly in this one province, mostly in this one province. So that's almost 1 billion units in 2015 where we have this data. And that's reflected in the trade statistics. So we have multiple years of that, obviously. So China's been dominating export production of mobile handsets for a long time. Back in 2017, 40%. 35%. So, and this has just gone up year after year. It's kind of stabilized after 2015. So the world needs China's manufacturing capacity for mobile phones. And there's been some shift to Vietnam, particularly Samsung has set up huge factories in Vietnam and is hiring, millions of workers there. But there's really no others that are coming for mobile phones anyway. You can see a lot of apparel coming out of Vietnam now, and furniture and a lot of other things. So Vietnam is kind of like the China +1 winner, and maybe a few other countries in East Asia. And so you see Vietnam kind of increasing its share, but still relatively minor compared to China in terms of exports of mobile handsets. China has been kind of learned, it's a longer story here, but they've learned how to play the standards game in some ways, particularly for 4G. They started in the 3G period, consolidated their activity in the standard setting body for 4G, and are really strong in 5G. So this is another data set where we scrape the code commits, the working items is another name for the same thing, folders filled with ideas for how these technical solutions are going to work in 4G, 3G, 4G, and 5G. And you can see China, the orange line, kind of coming on strong, both as an organizer of the working group, so, and 62% of the Chinese companies, working group leaders were Huawei. And then you can see Ericsson and Nokia, because this is really driven a lot by the network equipment companies. So you see Nokia and Ericsson kind of went away with handsets, but they still make a lot of telecom switching equipment for wireless. And so they're still very strong, but China's coming on strong. And then same idea with the actual items in the folders. So you have the folks organizing each working group around a particular technical topic, and then inside of those working groups are folders filled with technological solutions. Again, the whole group has a vote on kind of with a supermajority about which of these solutions are selected. So China has come in on strong with 5G on the standard side. And that's really gotten the attention of the China hawks in the United States. Because what runs on mobile networks? A lot of stuff. So state intervention is kind of ramping up, and we already saw essentially the same chart. But this is the kind of what's coming out of Washington, behind the CHIPS Act, the Semiconductor Industry Association. The share of semiconductors in the U.S. has dropped from 37% to 12%. Oh no! And I just, it's a great way to kind of get funding. Ka-ching! But a lot of this is, and China is a bad actor in many ways. Their human rights record is terrible. The way they're basically, ended the two China policy in Hong Kong, and they're, looming over Taiwan, which is, if you think about it, I mean, if you get Taiwan, you get a big chunk of the semiconductor industry, right? The thing is that semiconductor industry is riding on top of this whole ecosystem that is incredibly dependent on all the other parts of the ecosystem. And if they invade Taiwan, they don't get anything, really. Right? Because they're going to have a lot of people leaving. All those engineers are going to take what they know in their head. It's like a Werner von Braun situation after World War II. They'll have like all these Chinese, and it's terrible. I mean, laughing, but it's a horrible idea to even contemplate. But you don't get the semiconductor industry, the foundry industry, you don't get it. A lot of empty buildings and equipment that no one knows how to run. But so then there's this idea that, well, we can work without China as long as we can convince the companies that the Chinese market doesn't matter so much. We can run this whole, there's a recognition that U.S. and its allies, Japan, in Europe, U.S. mostly, they're sitting on top of a lot of technology, a lot of companies, a lot of standard setting capabilities, and we can kind of, if you're going to balkanize the world into two camps, China's going to lose. I mean, they're just not there yet, not even close. I think the data I showed underline that. But is that really going to work? So if you look at this kind of the sanctions regime against Huawei, you got the red countries are countries that signed on to sanctioning Huawei and not letting any equipment into their networks, et cetera. You got US, you got France, you got Japan, you got Australia. Oh, it's a lot of important countries. That's it. Everybody else is like, well, I don't know. We're sort of, we'll look at their stuff. Considering, India's considering it. And then there's a big chunks of the world that are just unlikely to play along. So this friend-shoring idea, I don't know. So you have these two paths. It really depends on where you're sitting. So on the right is this kind of idea of critical inputs. So a selective import substitution. This is the CHIPS Act, right? So on the right, high capital costs, and then you look on the left, this is the idea of full decoupling. We're going to recreate the entire semiconductor industry in China, down to all the equipment and every bolt that goes into the equipment. I mean, it's quixotic at best, but very high capital costs. I'll just walk down the left-hand side. The whole thing could just fall apart, and it seems like it's kind of close to doing that. The whole systemic failure, people leaving, and then you're going to invest $300 billion into an industry all in a space of 3 or 4 years. You're going to get a huge chunk of capacity that's going to make one generation of chips, but that's not how it works. You know, things are constantly evolving, and so it doesn't make sense. If you're not producing products for the whole world, you don't have the export scale. You're in a walled garden, including the complements that go with all of these pieces. You know, what are the products going to look like that come out of that semiconductor industry? Are they going to look like this? Or are they going to look like the cell phones we used to use back in the day with the big antenna? And will consumers accept that? On the right-hand side, you have high capital costs, and you have this other problem of, well, and this is, I've already alluded to this, you get some semiconductor manufacturing capacity, but whoops, all of the inputs, that huge stack of things, and many things are made in the US, but there's this whole ecosystem that goes into that's supporting the chip manufacturing in Taiwan, you know, gases and components and silicon wafers, et cetera, that you're going to have to then import to the US. And then you're back to the same problem. And then which segment are you going to pick? Is chip fabrication, chip manufacturing the right one? It certainly makes sense to have some more in the US, but maybe it's something else that's important. We just don't know. I mean, during the supply chain interruptions that we've seen, it's really been the simple chips that were in short supply because there's not very much manufacturing capacity for simple things that make microcontrollers that go into cars. Right? These are not big CPUs. These are kind of little computers that basically do one thing. They get a signal from a sensor, they process it, and and some output comes out. Those are very simple chips that are made in old semiconductor plants. Most of them in the US, Europe, some in China, but mostly elsewhere. So, you know, how do you know where the vulnerabilities lie? So then all of this, you know, kind of undermines this huge global collaborative environment network that is building these things on an ongoing basis that are incredibly innovative and complex and evolve over time. So you're kind of withdrawing from that. You can chop that up. You know, you're not going to get necessarily useful pieces. And then, you know, the learning that goes on in this whole system, you know, if you isolate chunks of it, you might not have that. So anyway, just to sum up kind of what this argument is that these three paradoxes kind of one leads to the next. So, and at the top, you know, this relational coordination, the idea that you have to sit together and work on things in close proximity, you know, that's because things are so complex, right? And that leads to market concentration. And the market concentration, you know, it's expressed geographically because many of these complex things are concentrated in particular places, like one or a few countries. And that creates this pressure for decoupling. So all the way along the top. At the bottom, you know, the scale of the whole thing leads to market fragmentation and the complementers. And this leads to dispersion. And that really is enabled by we have the centripetal tendencies in the system that comes from Carlos Baldwin, which is another way to think about it. But this is enabled by modularity. And that really kind of puts pressure because there's so many complex things in so many places for some kind of accommodation. So, you know, self-reliance might sound good. I think it's politically very, you know, appealing. Like, oh, we got to do it on our own. We were talking earlier about food, like, right? It's like, you got to have your own food. But you got to have your own chips too. But, you know, there's a strong incentive to kind of rebuild some type of system that can accommodate this type of interdependence, you know, in a sustainable way. And it's similar, you know, to climate change, right? This is like baked in interdependence. It's not something you can just say, oh, I mean, it's been happened over a 20 or 30-year period where things are spread out over the world and they're kind of tightly integrated and they're very geographically, vertically specialized for you economists in the room. So sooner or later, you know, we need to back away from kind of tribalism, you know, unproductive nationalism and zero-sum thinking that, you know, that there has to be some kind of, you know, some system that accommodates, you know, polycentric system where there can be multiple nodes of power and capability. Otherwise, the world just goes back, and this doesn't, like in terms of climate change, you know, the atmosphere doesn't know any borders. So I'll leave with a question, which is, you know, everything I've just talked about happens in 8 countries, right? So you can draw this picture of the iPhone 7 and, you know, 1,815 individual components in the iPhone 7. But the main components are traded just between 8 countries. There's 84 different deals that have been cut to do this. But what about the flyover countries? What about Latin America? What about South America? What about Africa? These are, you know, you're just watching the show, hoping for the best. Or is there a role for Argentina, for Latin America, to kind of help solve the problem? I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but I wanted to leave you with the question. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Agradecemos al doctor Timothy Sturgeon por su exposición. Reiteramos a aquellas personas interesadas en participar de la ronda de preguntas y respuestas vía streaming pueden enviar su pregunta llenando el formulario que se encuentra en la página. Ahora sí, vamos a pasar a la presentación del doctor Andrés López, quien desarrollará el tema desafíos y oportunidades para las cadenas globales en América Latina. Andrés López es doctor en Economía de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Actualmente se desempeña como director del Instituto Interdisciplinario de Economía Política de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, profesor de grado y posgrado de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y profesor invitado en la Universidad de San Andrés. Ha sido consultor de organismos internacionales y del sector público y sus trabajos han sido publicados en libros y revistas académicas nacionales y extranjeras. Escuchamos ahora al doctor López.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Ustedes habrán visto que, no sé por qué me quiere vender cosas. ¿Se está viendo? No. Bueno. Ustedes vieron que se puede contar la historia del mundo sin hablar de Latinoamérica, ¿no? Digamos, creo que se pasaron 80 slides y en uno apareció Brasil, ¿no? Creo que eso da una idea de dónde estamos, ¿no? Digamos, cuál es nuestro rol en el mundo. Voy a tratar de hacer un doble clic sobre el tema. Y la motivación es esta. Primero, ¿por qué se puede contar la historia del mundo sin Latinoamérica? Porque nos ha ido muy mal en los últimos años. Es decir, tenemos crecimiento PIB per cápita en la última década el menor de todo el planeta, por regiones. El crecimiento promedio de la productividad agregada entre el 82 y el 2018, el menor de todo el planeta. La productividad total de factores en los últimos 50 años, contribución nula o negativa al crecimiento. Es decir, desde el punto de vista del crecimiento somos evidentemente muy malos alumnos y además somos la segunda región más desigual del planeta. O sea que tenemos un desafío de inclusión muy significativo, un desafío de aumento de productividad muy significativo y países altamente heterogéneos en términos de sus mercados de trabajo, en términos de sus sectores, de sus regiones, etc. Entonces, la primera motivación es una mejor integración en el mundo. ¿Nos puede ayudar a resolver estos problemas? No como la única bala, pero ¿puede ayudar? Y hoy integración en el mundo es integrarse en cadenas de valor, por más que, como dijeron mis colegas, están cambiando, las cadenas de valor se están redefiniendo, todavía siguen andando por ahí. Y no solo la participación en las cadenas globales de valor puede ayudar a generar empleo y divisas, sino también a generar ganancias de productividad, que es uno de nuestros grandes pendientes, a través de ganancias de especialización en los mercados internacionales, acceso a mercados, importando insumos más baratos o aprendiendo a través de los networks, por ejemplo, lo que mencionaba Tim, ¿no? Digamos, el network de gente colaborando para hacer un teléfono celular, también es una masiva cadena de difusión e intercambio de conocimientos. Pero para participar de esas ganancias necesitamos que nuestros países tengan ciertas capacidades en materia de capital humano, proveedores locales eficientes, sistemas de innovación dinámicos. Enseguida vamos a ver que todo esto no nos va muy bien. Pero no se trata solo de participar en las cadenas, sino también de lo que la literatura llama hacer un upgrading en las cadenas. Y esto también no es solo escalar en las operaciones, sino desarrollar esas operaciones con mejores procesos, avanzar en calidad, diferenciación de productos, incluso pasar desde la producción de commodities que es donde, como vamos a ver, nos distinguimos, hacia los bienes diferenciados. Es interesante, el Banco Mundial, su último reporte, World Development Report de 2020, habla de la importancia de pasar de commodities a los bienes industriales. Hace 30 años eso no hubiera sido una conversación del Banco Mundial, ¿no? Es la época cuando Adam decía, ¿no?, la política industrial cancelled, ¿no? Hoy el Banco Mundial, World Development Report, dice, no, los países tienen que pasar de commodities a industria o a knowledge-based services, ¿no? Digamos, la nueva estrella, software, etcétera. Es decir, que podemos descansar en que hay una nueva ortodoxia, digamos, en esta materia. Y también algo que tiene que ver con lo que llamamos escalar en las tareas en las cadenas, es decir, pasar a desarrollar actividades más sofisticadas. Por ejemplo, Brasil es un gran productor de autos, que Tim lo sabe porque es un experto en la industria, no hay actividades de investigación y desarrollo significativas allí. Esto quiere decir que estamos en las actividades donde quizás no se genera el mayor valor agregado. Y, last but not least, en países heterogéneos, este ingreso y escalamiento en las cadenas tiene que incluir el grueso de la sociedad, y sabemos que hay grandes heterogeneidades. Por ejemplo, México, una cosa es el norte y otra cosa es el sur, ¿no? Son dos planetas diferentes, y mucho tiene que ver con cómo se integran en cadenas de valor, pero también los trabajadores, se ha sufrido en la pandemia, las enormes dificultades que han tenido una gran masa de la población para teletrabajar, son resultado de diferencias en los contextos familiares, acceso a Internet, etc. Entonces, hay una oportunidad para América Latina, ya mis colegas hablaron, nearshoring, friendshoring, la regionalización de las cadenas, más regionalización, porque ya había, ¿no? Ya eran regionales fundamentalmente, o diversificación de lugares de abastecimiento, etc. ¿Esto es una nueva oportunidad para América Latina? Ahora, la última oportunidad que tuvimos fue el superciclo de commodities, especialmente para América del Sur. Entre 2001 y 2011, las exportaciones de commodities se multiplicaron por 5 en 10 años. ¿Y qué hicimos con eso? ¿Aprovechamos la oportunidad? Sí, exportamos 5 veces más en 10 años. Ahora, hubo transformación estructural de las economías, la productividad se aceleró, las ganancias de inclusión que se alcanzaron fueron para atrás, poco después de terminar el ciclo de commodities. Quizás varios países mejoraron su management macroeconómico, no nosotros, por cierto, ¿no? Pero no hubo una... What does it mean aprovechar una oportunidad, ¿no? Digamos, entonces, no es solo la idea de aprovechar la oportunidad para vender más, sino para encarar el proceso de transformación estructural de nuestras economías. Entonces, lo que quiero hacer es un poco ver dónde estamos, los voy a abrumar un poco con los números, mapear algunas oportunidades, atractivos de América Latina en el nuevo contexto y los obstáculos, decir, cosa que seguramente todos sabemos, que América Latina es en realidad una entidad inexistente, porque hay varias Américas Latinas y tenemos que desarmar esa noción, ¿no? Quizás para el mundo etnocéntrico, ¿no? América Latina es un conjunto indiferenciado, pero no lo es. Y finalmente, ¿cuál es la agenda que es desafiante? Tengo 3 partes. Primero, un poquito, ya casi todo lo dijeron Tim y Adam, hacia dónde van las cadenas globales de valor. La segunda, los voy a abrumar con números, los voy a tratar de pasar rápido. ¿Cuáles son las principales tendencias de la integración en América Latina? Y tercero, las oportunidades y desafíos en el nuevo escenario. No necesito hablar mucho de esto, casi todo se dijo. Hay varios canales de presión para reorganizar las cadenas, temores a nuevas disrupciones por episodios similares a COVID, el tema de la robustez, la resiliencia, las tensiones geopolíticas. Adam se expandió mucho y bien sobre eso, China, Rusia, la guerra, y la reducción de la huella de carbono, ¿no? Acortar las cadenas, esa es una presión, ¿no? Y hacerlas más sustentables desde el punto de vista, por ejemplo, de las fuentes energéticas. Tenemos un segundo tema que es fundamental porque implica desafíos muy importantes para nuestros países de formación de capital humano, que es la aceleración del cambio tecnológico post-COVID. Como todos sabemos, se aceleró la tendencia al uso de plataformas y tecnologías digitales, se aceleró la automatización de tareas, los robots no se enferman, no contagian, y un tema importante que a mí me preocupa mucho, y si a alguien le interesa podemos charlarlo, que es el aumento del trabajo freelance remoto. Eso mucha gente lo ve como una gran oportunidad. Un montón de nuestros jóvenes van a trabajar directamente para empresas de Estados Unidos, Europa, etcétera, en la gran gig economy, ¿no? Y eso que puede ser muy bueno para esos jóvenes, no sé si es tan bueno para los países, ¿no? Esos jóvenes no pagan seguridad social, esos jóvenes no pagan impuestos, en nuestro país ni siquiera traen las divisas por el cepo, y además destruyen lo que para mí es la fuente principal de aprendizaje y de generación de competencias, que es la empresa. Es decir, vamos a tener millones de programadores negociando uno a uno en plataformas contra Google. Creo que no es una buena tendencia para los países en desarrollo. Es muy buena para los chicos que ganan hoy $5.000 y los vemos cenar en restaurantes fancies, pero... Tercer tema, ¿cómo van a evolucionar las políticas? Mis colegas hablaron mucho del tecnonacionalismo, proteccionismo, etcétera. Hay un punto fundamental para varios países de América Latina, en particular para los de América Central, pero también para nuestro vecino Uruguay. El marco inclusivo BEPS. Si esto progresa, va a haber un mínimo de impuesto a las ganancias del 15% global. Y muchos países de América Latina compiten no cobrando impuestos a las empresas. Básicamente en América Central, en Dominicana, pero también acá cruzando el charco, ¿no? Digamos, ¿qué va a pasar con eso? Es un tema interesante. ¿Y cómo nos vamos a adaptar al cambio climático? Yo no sé, realmente no, creo que, por supuesto no conozco todo el debate en América Latina. En nuestro país es un non-issue, por ejemplo, esto, ¿no? Digamos, ¿qué va a pasar si la Unión Europea, con los mecanismos de ajuste en frontera de la Unión Europea? ¿Qué va a pasar con la creciente exigencia de estándares vinculados al cumplimiento de normas ambientales, etcétera, con la transición energética? Grandes desafíos. Un warning. Seguramente las cadenas se van a reorganizar, pero ya mis colegas hablaron de esto, no va a ser un proceso tan rápido ni tan lineal probablemente. En particular porque para cambiar de proveedores necesitas construir relaciones de confianza a largo plazo, necesitas que esos proveedores tengan capacidades usualmente poco replicables. Tim mencionaba el caso de Ohio, ¿no? Digamos, y los semiconductores, no es tan fácil, ¿no? Digamos, que ponerse a hacer semiconductores de un día para otro. Esto va a tener impacto sobre costo de producción en un mundo donde la inflación es un problema. Y luego, yo no creo que las empresas se vayan, mis colegas seguramente saben más porque están en el mundo desarrollado, pero yo no creo que las empresas estadounidenses se quieran ir totalmente de Asia, porque así va a estar el mercado, más importante y más dinámico del planeta. O sea que yo sería prudente con la idea de que va a haber una retirada masiva de Asia. Y también hay problemas, incluso, por ejemplo, la exposición a riesgo no necesariamente se reduce con cadenas más cercanas. Aquí no podíamos cruzar la General Paz. O sea que no es solo que no podía llegar un barco de China. Yo no podía ir a ver una persona que estaba en otra jurisdicción. E incluso, por supuesto, no tiene ningún sentido y es totalmente ineficiente que todos, por ejemplo, nos pongamos a hacer equipo de protección médica o vacunas. Es absurdo, ¿no? Digamos, no sé si eso ayuda a la resiliencia o la empeora, porque la interdependencia tiene algunas ventajas. Y un par de datos. La IED en China, la inversión extranjera directa en China el año 2021 creció 21% y fue récord histórico en valores corrientes. Ustedes me dirán, es un lag, esto va a bajar, pero por ahora nadie se fue de China, ¿no? Digamos, masivamente. Y en segundo lugar, hay varias encuestas, ¿no? El Kearney Reshoring Index mide el peso de las importaciones de bienes industriales desde Asia sobre la producción industrial de Estados Unidos. O sea, ¿cuánto es el ratio de importaciones de insumos que viene de 14 países asiáticos, incluido China, sobre la producción industrial de Estados Unidos? ¿Qué pasó en 2020 y 2021 con ese ratio? Subió los 2 años. O sea, no hubo menos importaciones de Asia, hubo más importaciones de Asia. Todo esto puede cambiar, pero yo me gusta quedarme en el pasado porque es más confiable, ¿no? Digamos, que el futuro. Entonces, es un mundo que habito mejor que el del futuro. Todo esto no significa que las cadenas no se vayan a reorganizar, pero este proceso puede ser gradual. Puede diferir mucho en intensidad y características según sectores y cadenas. Seguramente no va a ser lo mismo los textiles que los semiconductores o los mobile phones o los autos. Ojo, porque Estados Unidos, yo no creo que la administración Biden, seguramente Tim y Adam pueden tener mejor opinión, están impulsando el reshoring y no necesariamente el nearshoring, ¿no? Digamos, en todo caso puede ser el friendshoring con países aliados, pero es muy nacionalista el approach que hay hoy en Washington, a mi juicio, y América Latina, nuevamente me pueden corregir mis colegas, no les importa mucho, salvo México y eventualmente limitar la inmigración del Triángulo Norte, ¿no? De Honduras, El Salvador, etcétera, pero no creo que, no estamos en la agenda, me parece a mí. Y tercero, si queremos aprovechar las oportunidades que seguramente existen, necesitamos hacer algo nosotros, y eso viene de la agenda local. Bueno, algunas cuestiones para poner algunos números, y voy a ir muy rápido. Primero, América Latina es una región poco intensiva en comercio. Nosotros, exportación de bienes y servicios sobre PBI es 23% contra 28% del mundo, 39% en Asia. Pero América Latina, primer punto, heterogeneidad. México tiene el mismo porcentaje de exportaciones de bienes y servicios sobre PBI que Asia, y América Central muy cerca. En el otro extremo, Argentina y Brasil está abajo de India y China. Somos más cerrados que India y China, que son economías mucho más grandes. O sea que tenemos entonces economías que tienen muy diversos grados de integración al mundo. Y Argentina y Brasil son economías particularmente llamativas por lo cerradas. Segundo, hemos perdido relevancia en la economía global. El rojo marca el share de América Latina en exportaciones globales de bienes, en ingreso de inversión extranjera directa y en exportaciones de servicios basados en conocimiento, que son software, servicios empresariales, etc. 2010-2021, en los tres fuimos para abajo. Es decir, hemos perdido relevancia en la economía global, tanto en exportación de bienes como de servicios modernos, como de atracción de inversión extranjera directa. Y en el caso de bienes, y pongo la referencia 8%, América Latina y el Caribe es el 8% del PBI mundial. Su share en exportaciones de bienes y de servicios basados en conocimiento es considerablemente inferior. Tercero, por supuesto, el contraste con Asia Oriental, ¿no? Ahí vemos un largo plazo, 1970-2021. Partimos de lugares bastante parecidos y nos sacaron una distancia tremenda. Esto es, exportaciones globales, arriba a la izquierda, inversión extranjera directa entrante y abajo inversión extranjera directa saliente. Eso es algo que seguramente todos saben. Asia hoy, por ejemplo, representa un cuarto de toda la inversión extranjera que se emite en el planeta. Cuando yo empecé a estudiar temas de Foreign Direct Investment, eso no estaba pasando, ¿no? En los años. Y esto es un fenómeno nuevo. Y América Latina recibe muy poco de eso. Estamos lejos. Es decir, no somos un gran... Es decir, la inversión extranjera directa global sale cada vez más de Asia y nosotros no somos un target, salvo en industrias extractivas, básicamente, y algo en infraestructura. Pero también, incluso desafiando la geografía, pero no la economía, Asia ha ganado, es el principal proveedor de los Estados Unidos, en particular el sector de manufacturas, y esto no ha cambiado mucho. Fíjense el gráfico de abajo, eso es... El rojo, siempre, el naranja siempre es Asia. Asia es, este, sur y sureste de Asia, ¿no? Sacamos los países árabes, etc. 50% de las importaciones de manufactura de Estados Unidos han venido consistentemente en los últimos 25 años de Asia y entre el 11 y el 15% de América Latina. De vuelta, ¿qué pasó en 2020-2021? Creció levemente el porcentaje de importaciones de manufacturas de Estados Unidos que viene de Asia, contrariamente a lo que uno pensaría con el nearshoring, etc. Toda la ganancia de América Latina y el Caribe de estos 25 años, de 11 a 16%, es México y algo de Centroamérica. Es todo México, como vamos a ver. Y esto es desagregado por sectores. 4 grandes sectores industriales: químicos, textiles y vestimenta, automotriz, electrónica. En electrónica y en textiles, Asia es 75% de todas las importaciones manufactureras de Estados Unidos y América Latina es 10-15%. Solo en autos, América Latina tiene el mismo share que Asia y es el único sector en donde ha venido ganando participación. De vuelta, ¿cómo se llama eso? México. No es solo una cosa, es México. Es México. Todo lo demás no existe. Y después, en químicos, también, ¿no? Digamos, Asia quizás no es un dominant player como en ropa o electrónico, pero de todos modos tiene 5 veces más de share que América Latina en las importaciones de Estados Unidos. Entonces, hemos venido perdiendo relevancia en la economía global y en particular frente a Asia, incluso como proveedor de lo que sería nuestro hub natural, que es Estados Unidos. ¿Qué exportamos nosotros? Perdón. Bueno, ahí ya va a volver, espero, ¿no? Hello, ¿se pasó algo? ¿Toco algo? ¿No? Bueno, ok. América Latina y el Caribe, les cuento el gráfico que no ven, pero América Latina y el Caribe, entre 1995 y 2021, participó con el 10% de... Sí. Perdón, seguramente es un chip chino que se niega a actuar. Bueno, les decía, ¿qué exporta América Latina? Entre 1995 y 2021, América Latina participó consistentemente con el 10% de las exportaciones mundiales de commodities. 10%. Participó con el 3,5% de las exportaciones de manufacturas y con menos del 3% de las exportaciones de servicios. Es decir, que nuestro rol fundamental en la economía es exportando commodities, como ya sabemos, y ese es nuestro rol tradicional, en particular de América del Sur. No tengo nada contra la exportación de commodities. No creo en la literatura de maldición de los recursos naturales, pero sí creo que hay una abundante literatura que muestra que la dependencia de la exportación de commodities, que no es lo mismo que exportar muchos commodities, ¿no? Digamos, no es lo mismo. Una cosa es exportar muchos commodities y otra cosa es depender de la exportación de commodities. La dependencia de la exportación de commodities puede ser peligrosa para el crecimiento, en particular por el lado de la volatilidad a los shocks de precios y cantidades, temas de clima, etc. Perdón. Ahí está. Bueno, perdón. No, deja, bueno, acá estaba. Sí, gracias. Pero les quiero mostrar algo más todavía. Ustedes seguramente conocen el Atlas de la Complejidad Económica de Hausmann Hidalgo, ¿no? ¿Cuántos países latinoamericanos están entre las primeras 50 naciones de complejidad exportadora? 3. México, Panamá y Costa Rica. Y Panamá es una falsa complejidad porque es reexportación, ¿no? de la logística, el canal, etc. Así que son 2 de verdad. Hay 7 de Asia emergente y 2 están en el top 10 de complejidad, es decir, que exportan productos, su canasta exportadora es altamente sofisticada y diversificada, y 15 países de Europa del Este. Y 2 están en el top 10. Pero no solo que exportamos productos poco complejos, sino que exportamos pocos productos de lo que se llama calidad superior, es decir, productos con alto nivel de precio unitario. No solo exportamos commodities, sino que dentro de los commodities avanzamos poco en la cadena de valor hacia productos de mayor diferenciación. Y esto es particularmente relevante en América del Sur. En América del Sur, en el año 2000, los commodities representaban el 65% de las exportaciones totales. El 2021, el 81%. Es decir, que si el Banco Mundial dice vayan para allá, nosotros vamos para acá, ¿no? Digamos, estamos wrong turn. Pero además, las canastas les quiero mostrar esto, algunos ejercicios que hice. Ahí estoy comparando América del Sur, América Central y México, Asia y Europa del Este. Y lo que mido es, en el top 10 de la canasta exportadora de cada país, ¿cuántos productos nuevos hay en el 2021 versus el 2001? ¿Ok? Dentro de los 10 primeros productos que exporta cada país, ¿cuántos productos nuevos hay en el 2021 versus el 2001? Los verdes son los que tienen más productos, los amarillos y naranjas están en el medio, los rojos y naranjas tienen muy pocos nuevos productos. Bueno, van a ver que hay mucho verde, fíjense en los 4 dígitos del sistema armonizado, ¿no? La columna de la izquierda. Hay mucho verde y amarillo en Europa del Este y en Asia, hay mucho más rojo y naranja y amarillo en América del Sur, y también hay bastante verde en América Central. América Central ha diversificado mucho su canasta exportadora, casi en paralelo con Europa del Este y Asia. América del Sur la ha diversificado, la ha transformado muy poco. ¿Cuántos de los nuevos productos que aparecen en el 2021 vis a vis el 2001 son commodities? En América Latina el 85%. Nuestros export discoveries son los viejos export discoveries, ¿no? Digamos, no son new export discoveries. O en todo caso, el litio, por ejemplo, pero el litio no es, en realidad, bueno, es de vuelta, ¿no? Digamos, es un nuevo staple de la minería. En cambio, en Europa del Este, en Asia, en América Central, menos del 30%, y es el caso de Europa del Este, de los nuevos productos son commodities. Es decir, que nuestras nuevas estrellas exportadoras son esencialmente commodities. Pero no solo pasa eso, sino que además, si yo miro el top 10 exportador a 4 dígitos, esto es, ¿cuánto representan las exportaciones de estos productos estrella a 4 dígitos sobre el total de exportaciones? América Latina ha crecido la concentración del 61 al 70%, mientras que, y está en niveles muy superiores a América Central, a Asia y Europa del Este. O sea que nuestra canasta exportadora está altamente comoditizada y concentrada. Una manera alternativa a ver esto es el cuadro de abajo, un índice de concentración Herfindahl que calcula la UNTAD de concentración de exportaciones. América Latina no solo es el continente, la región, América del Sur no solo es la región con mayor índice de concentración, sino que ese nivel de concentración ha crecido entre el 95 y el 2021 de manera sustantiva. Es decir, que si la literatura te dice que el crecimiento está asociado a la diversificación exportadora, de vuelta, la literatura dice vaya para allá y nosotros vamos para allá. América del Sur está no solo comoditizando, sino concentrando su cadena, su canasta exportadora. Incluso más allá de agrandando distancias con otras regiones. ¿Y qué pasa con los servicios basados en conocimiento? Cosa que en Argentina nos encanta hablar, porque tenemos muchos unicornios, ¿no? Mercado Libre, Globant. Pero ¿qué pasa? América Latina como un todo. América Latina como un todo tiene el 8% de la población mundial, un poco más. ¿Cuánto participa con las exportaciones de Knowledge Based Services? Menos de 2%. Es decir que, y eso creo que es una comparación bastante justa, porque son servicios trabajo intensivos, o sea que nosotros estamos participando mucho menos, un cuarto menos que lo que tenemos de población, y eso refleja, por supuesto, déficit de capital humano y de otros temas, pero además esa participación cayó de 2 a 1.8%, es decir, incluso hemos perdido terreno en el mundo altamente dinámico de los servicios basados en conocimiento. No los quiero deprimir, pero that's the way things are. Estamos integrados en las cadenas de valor mucho menos que otras regiones. Estos son datos del Banco Mundial. Tenemos menos backward participation y el otro es forward participation, perdón, ¿no? Está mal el título. Es decir, backward participation es cuánto tus exportaciones tienen insumos importados, ¿no? Forward participation es cuánto tú exportás insumos que son procesados en el exterior y reexportados. En ambos estamos por debajo de América, de East Asia y de Europa y Asia Central. Y, por cierto, radicamos muy pocas tareas basadas en conocimiento. En América Latina, solo Brasil y México atraen, por ejemplo, algo de inversión en Research and Development, el resto está bastante alejado de eso. Otra característica distintiva, y no muy buena, es que comerciamos poco entre nosotros. En Europa, el comercio interregional es 70% del comercio total. En Asia es 60%. En América del Norte es 30%. En América Latina y el Caribe es el mismo nivel que África, 15%. Es decir, estamos desintegrados como región. No solo estamos poco integrados al mundo, sino desintegrados como región. Lo mismo pasa con la inversión extranjera directa. En Europa, la inversión extranjera directa intrarregional, desde Europa hacia Europa, es 70% de toda la inversión que llega. En Asia es 33%, en América del Norte 20%, en América Latina y África 10%. 10%. Lo interesante es que el comercio interregional es pequeño, pero es mucho más diversificado que el comercio extrarregional, Comerciamos mucho más manufacturas entre nosotros, comerciamos manufacturas más complejas tecnológicamente y comerciamos manufacturas que tienen mayor nivel de precio unitario, es decir, son más diferenciadas. Pero comerciamos poco entre nosotros. Y esto, además, ha venido perdiendo participación. Estos gráficos, que parecen difíciles de leer y lo son, América Latina de vuelta es el azul, Asia es el rojo. Estas son las importaciones de América Latina como un todo por región de origen. 1995-2021. Vean la columna, el gráfico de abajo, que es manufacturas. En el año 1995, Asia era el 15% de las importaciones de manufacturas de América Latina. América Latina aportaba un 12%. En el año 2021, Asia representó el 44% de todas las importaciones de manufacturas de América Latina y América Latina fue el origen de apenas el 10%. Es decir que la participación de América Latina como proveedor interregional cayó 2%, la de Asia subió 30 puntos, y en el 2021 hay todavía un pequeño aumento de Asia, de 43 a 44%. De vuelta, mañana podemos hacer el decoupling con Asia. Not happening right now, ¿no? Digamos, no por ahora, so far. Si esto lo desagregamos, vamos a ver lo mismo en químicos, textiles, en textiles, en automotriz y en electrónica. Por ejemplo, Asia nos provee el 77% de todas las exportaciones, de todas las importaciones de productos electrónicos de América Latina y nosotros apenas el 4%. En textiles, Asia provee el 62% de todas las importaciones de América Latina apenas el 14%. Solo en autos tenemos una participación un poco más relevante y enseguida vamos a ver de dónde viene esa participación. Pero como les dije, hay desempeños divergentes. Y acá quisiera distinguir 4 mundos, y me voy a concentrar, porque estamos en Argentina, un poco en Mercosur y contrastarlo con México. Mercosur, en los gráficos que sigue, es la línea amarilla. Una cosa que no aclaré, todos estos cálculos de América Latina excluyen a Venezuela, porque eso es un lío tremendo, ¿no? Digamos, en las estadísticas. Venezuela está fuera de todos estos cálculos. No, para que no digan, no, bueno, no. Venezuela está fuera. Vean, la línea amarilla es Mercosur, la línea azul es México. 2010-2021, exportaciones de bienes, IED entrante, exportaciones de servicios basados en conocimiento. ¿Qué vemos? La línea amarilla, que es Mercosur, consistentemente cae. Mercosur es cada vez menos relevante en América Latina en materia de exportaciones de bienes, en materia de atracción de inversión extranjera directa y en materia de exportaciones de servicios basados en conocimiento. ¿Quién crece? México. Y en menor medida Centroamérica, especialmente en exportaciones de servicios basados en conocimiento. Es decir que dentro de América Latina Mercosur está perdiendo relevancia, por ejemplo en el comercio global, en la inversión global. También pierde importancia en las importaciones que se hacen desde Estados Unidos. Estos son, fíjense la línea de abajo, las importaciones de manufactura de Estados Unidos por origen, de América Latina. ¿De dónde vienen? 88% de México. El resto no existe. No somos proveedores relevantes de los Estados Unidos. E incluso Mercosur cayó de 11 a 5% entre el año 1995 y el 2021. Es decir que nos hemos estado perdiendo share como proveedores de los Estados Unidos, de vuelta a nuestro hub natural. Si lo desagregamos por sector, fíjense los dos de abajo, automotriz y electrónico, México es el 100% de las importaciones a Estados Unidos de América Latina, el 100%. Y en textiles, entre Centroamérica y México son el 80%. De vuelta, no tenemos un play y Mercosur cae en casi todos estos sectores. Incluso cae el Mercosur como proveedor intrarregional. De vuelta, miren solo el de abajo. Esas son las importaciones intrarregionales de manufacturas de América Latina y el Caribe. Es decir, ¿de dónde importamos como continente nuestros productos que vienen del continente de manufacturas? Mercosur cae del 57 al 48%, es decir, no solo perdemos peso frente a las importaciones de Estados Unidos, sino también frente a las importaciones del continente al cual pertenecemos. De vuelta, ¿quién gana? Share, México del 15 al 23, América Central del 10 al 14. Y acá lo miramos de vuelta por los subsectores, químicos, textiles, ropa, automotriz, productos electrónicos. Curiosamente, el único lugar en donde el Mercosur no perdió abastecimiento intrarregional es en autos. En todo lo demás se cayó y en algunos lados estrepitosamente. Fíjense en de electrónica. en el año 1995, Mercosur era el 50% de las importaciones de América Latina desde América Latina. Es decir, la mitad de todas las importaciones que América Latina hacía desde el propio continente de electrónica venían de Mercosur. ¿Cuánto es esto en el año 2021? 11%. ¿Quién ganó share? México, del 34 al 64. Y algo América Central. También cuando hablamos de complejidad exportadora, son dos mundos. Esto es bastante sencillo. Aquí las estrellas azules son el ranking el lugar del país en el ranking de complejidad exportadora en el 2000. La X naranja es el lugar 2019. Siempre que el punto naranja está arriba del azul, el país perdió complejidad. Quiere decir, está más arriba, quiere decir que está peor, ¿no? Está más lejos en el ranking. Toda América del Sur perdió complejidad. Buena parte de América Central y México la ganó. De vuelta, dos mundos, ¿no? Es decir, nuestras canastas exportadoras se fueron descomplejizando, no sé si eso existe, y las de América Central y México se fueron complejizando. Voy a pasar por esto para no aburrirlos, pero también básicamente lo que muestra es que México y América Central están mucho más integrados en cadenas de valor que América del Sur, y en particular que Mercosur. Por ejemplo, 2017-2019, el share de insumos importados sobre exportaciones en Mercosur es 16%, en América Latina 18%, en México 30%, en Asia 33%, en Europa 43%. Toda América Latina está atrasada, pero México está mucho más cerca que Mercosur, por ejemplo. Tenemos entonces dos patrones de comercio y de integración. Uno, muy basado en recursos naturales en América Latina y muy orientado a exportar esos recursos naturales a Asia-Pacífico, y en particular a China. Otro muy orientado a exportación de manufacturas y al comercio con Estados Unidos en América Central y México. Y América Central y México, ¿qué ofrece? Bajos costos laborales, incentivos fiscales en zonas francas, tal vez insustentables, si se aplica el marco inclusivo BEPS, y tratados de libre comercio, más la cercanía a Estados Unidos. Pero aún esos países tampoco han tenido un desempeño tan bueno. Acá tengo dos gráficos. El de la izquierda compara los países de América Central y más avanzados en términos de PIB per cápita. Costa Rica, República Dominicana y México, son los azules. Los rojos son tres comparadores de Asia Oriental, Indonesia, Tailandia y Malasia. Y los verdes son tres países de comparación de Europa del Este, Polonia, Rumania y Hungría. Fíjense que en el 2000 estaban todos muy cerca. En el 2021 los países de Europa del Este se fueron muy lejos de los países de América Central. México, en particular, fíjense, es la tercera barra azul, era un país que era el tercero en términos de PIB per cápita, ese grupo de 9 países, en el año 2000 es el séptimo. Es decir, que México, con toda su integración en la economía global, no ha tenido un buen desempeño en el largo plazo económico. Costa Rica y Dominicana lo hicieron mucho mejor, ¿no? Países pequeños, con instituciones más o menos sólidas, en particular Costa Rica, un nivel de capital humano elevado para la región, pero tenemos que ir a buscarlos, ¿no? Como el caso, ¿no? Costa Rica, cada vez que hablamos de integración en la economía global y éxito, hablamos de Intel, de los aparatos médicos en Costa Rica y no salimos de ahí. Pero miren lo que pasa en los países del Triángulo Norte, que son más pobres, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. En el año 2000 los comparo con Camboya, Laos, Vietnam y Bangladesh. Adam, ¿no? Habló de Bangladesh, team de Vietnam. Recuerdo que en Camboya estaba Pol Pot hasta hace no tanto tiempo, ¿no? Digamos, si uno decía, en el año 2000, el PIB per cápita en paridad de poder adquisitivo de Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador era superior al de los 4 países asiáticos. Bueno, pues hoy Vietnam está bastante por arriba de ellos y Laos está por arriba de Honduras y bastante cerca de Honduras y de Guatemala y El Salvador, e incluso Camboya, que viene más atrás, se le está acercando a Honduras, con lo cual quiere decir que los países del Triángulo Norte, que se integran fundamentalmente vendiendo textiles a los Estados Unidos y algunos manufactura liviana, han tenido una performance menos dinámica que la de los países comparables de Asia del Este. ¿Por qué pasa todo esto? Bueno, la lista es tan larga que es como ustedes van al médico, al control anual y le dice, tiene el colesterol alto, la glucemia es alta, la presión arterial es alta, las arterias están un poco tapadas, los triglicéridos son altos y el médico les dice, ustedes tienen que hacer ejercicio, tienen que cambiar la dieta, tienen que dormir más, etcétera, etcétera, y entonces ustedes dicen, bueno, tienen una tan larga lista de cosas que hacer que no empiezan por ninguna. Pero dependiendo qué reporte leamos y de qué organismo, de qué división de cada organismo internacional, van a hacer hincapié en alguna. Instituciones, políticas comerciales restrictivas, no hay convergencia regulatoria intrarregional, la infraestructura es mala, los mercados financieros son poco profundos, el capital humano nos va muy mal. Miren, las pruebas PISA son vergonzosas, ¿no? Digamos, son vergonzosas la performance de América Latina, etcétera. Pero quiero mencionar dos cosas que me parecen relevantes y que quizás la última me conecta con la discusión de Adam y Tim. Primero, que América Latina es la región más distante del mundo en términos físicos a los hubs del comercio global, en promedio, y América del Sur más que América Central y Argentina más que nadie. Estamos lejos, y eso para el comercio de servicios no importa, pero para el comercio de bienes sigue importando, estamos muy lejos. No es una percepción, es una medición. Pero la otra cosa es que el hub que pertenecemos, y vuelvo sobre algo, no parece que le interesemos mucho. En la Unión Europea, todos estos países República Checa, Rumania, tienen las ayudas, tienen los mecanismos de compensación, acuerdos profundos, etc. En Asia, los Flying Geese, networks de comercio e inversiones entre los países. Estados Unidos, ¿qué ofrece? ¿Qué ofrece para los países de América Latina? ¿Ofrece incentivos fiscales? ¿Ofrece ayuda? ¿Ofrece créditos? Yo veo que ofrece palabras por ahora, ¿no? Digamos, pero no hay una política activa de incorporación de los países de América Latina al hub de Estados Unidos, e incluso la última negociación con México fue más bien en contra de México, ¿no? Digamos, y no a favor de México. Y en América del Sur, encima de eso, nos falta, estamos lejos de América del Norte, no tenemos un hub intrarregional, Brasil no juega ese rol, claramente, y tenemos una geografía horrible, con muchas barreras al comercio intrarregional. Los procesos de integración están, como Mercosur, están estancados y fragmentados, y entonces tenemos, por supuesto, una serie de determinantes adicionales. Ahora, ¿hay oportunidades? Sí. Les quiero vender algo. Y con esto termino. Sí. Si vamos a tomar en serio que se van a cortar las cadenas y el friendshoring va a tener alguna entidad, esto ofrece una oportunidad para América Latina. El Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo ha hecho una serie de estudios, uno de los cuales muestra que si América Latina capturara el 10% de las importaciones que vienen de Asia a Estados Unidos y al propio continente, las exportaciones de América Latina subirían 78.000 millones de dólares, con el 10% de shift, ¿no? Desde Asia a la región. 55% de todo eso es México. O sea que la gran oportunidad la tiene México en realidad, ¿no? Y en menor medida el resto de los países. El propio BID y otros organismos están ofreciendo ayuda para el nearshoring y algunos países han puesto en marcha estrategias focalizadas, República Dominicana, etcétera, y lo que tenemos para vender fundamentalmente como continente es que somos una zona libre de conflictos militares. No esperamos una guerra Rusia-Ucrania en América Latina, por suerte. Y hay una serie de estudios nacionales y sectoriales que también encomendó el BID, que muestran que hay oportunidades en distintos sectores para distintos países. Estos son solo ejemplos, en textiles y confecciones, en automotriz y autopartes, en farmacéutica, en dispositivos médicos, en forestal, en electrónica, en aeroespacial, en logística, en recursos naturales, en servicios basados en conocimiento, etc. Ahora, ¿qué ventajas tenemos? América Central y México tiene más ventajas que América del Sur para participar de esta oportunidad. Tiene acuerdos de libre comercio con Estados Unidos y otros mercados clave. Tiene una estabilidad macroeconómica envidiable, incluso en países muy pobres y con débiles marcos institucionales. Los costos de la mano de obra son competitivos. Varios países todavía tienen un bono demográfico. Son pequeños, pero igualmente tienen una gran diversidad de recursos naturales. Salvo en México, hay un peso creciente de las fuentes de energía renovables, lo cual ayuda a la transición energética vinculada al nearshoring. Ya son destinos reconocidos para el offshoring de tareas, tienen incentivos fiscales y aduaneros, aunque pueden estar en amenaza los fiscales, y está cerca y tiene afinidad cultural y usos horarios compartidos con Estados Unidos. América del Sur, en cambio, es más heterogénea. Primero, tiene mayor distancia con Estados Unidos, pero no es lo mismo Colombia que Argentina. Algunos países tienen muchos TLCs y otros pocos. Colombia tiene muchos tratados de libre comercio, Chile también, Mercosur tiene pocos. La disponibilidad de recursos humanos calificados es variable, los costos laborales son variables, las estructuras productivas también. Hay en general abundancia y diversidad de recursos naturales, pero cada uno tiene su propia especialización, minería, petróleo, agro, etc. Y lo único que compartimos con América Central son los usos horarios compartidos y la afinidad cultural. Frente a esto hay una serie de desafíos si queremos aprovechar estas ventajas. Pero yo se los muestro, ustedes léanlo, porque estas shopping list me parecen horrorosas. Es decir, porque es de vuelta, el médico te dice tenés que hacer A, B, C y D. Y cuando el médico le dijo a Groucho, mi frase favorita de Groucho Marx es la siguiente historia. Un día va el médico, es un invento seguramente de Groucho, pero está en su autobiografía imaginaria, ficticia. Le dice a Groucho Marx, mire, señor Marx, su hígado está muy mal estado, si no deja de tomar, en 6 meses se va a morir. En cambio, si deja de tomar, va a vivir una vida muy larga. Y Groucho le dice, mire, no sé si va a ser larga, pero me va a parecer interminable. Entonces, todos estos esfuerzos que hay que hacer tal vez nos hagan la vida interminable y no sabemos por dónde empezar. Integración, infraestructura, adaptaciones regulatorias, sustentabilidad. Voy a pasar porque no quiero robar más tiempo, pero quiero pasar las 2 filminas finales. No niego que exista una oportunidad, al contrario, probablemente existe una oportunidad para aprovechar. Los países tienen que tomar decisiones en el contexto de alta incertidumbre global, que es lo que mencionó Adam y Tim. No sabemos cómo va a ser el mundo y hay un montón de cosas que ignoramos, pero hay que tomar decisiones. Mucho de lo que pase va a depender de si Estados Unidos enfatiza el reshoring, ayuda realmente al nearshoring o al friendshoring y qué incentivos hay para que los países de América Latina se incorporen a ese proceso de potencial decoupling o al menos de parcial separación de Asia. Pero también América Latina y el Caribe tienen que tener sus propias decisiones. Por ejemplo, ¿cuáles son nuestro rol frente a la disputa Estados Unidos-China? Multipolaridad, elegir el socio estratégico. ¿Cuánto nos coordinamos o competimos? Todos los países compiten por los mismos sectores. No veo ningún país de América Latina que esté buscando atraer inversiones para cadenas intrarregionales. Cada uno busca individualmente, ¿no? Negociar con China o con Estados Unidos. Ni siquiera estamos de acuerdo en los modelos de desarrollo. Bolivia es el país probablemente uno de los países con mayores recursos de litio del mundo. Por la insistencia en querer hacer baterías de litio, no produce nada de litio en los últimos 20 años. Entonces ese modelo tecnonacionalista. Y requerimos más integración, pero una mejor integración. Diversificación, diferenciación de exportaciones, upgrade en tareas de valor. Las oportunidades, ¿dónde están? Sin duda para América Central y México en la manufactura. Y en América del Sur están en los commodities. Pero podemos hacer algo con los commodities. Podemos avanzar en diferenciación de productos y podemos avanzar en encadenamientos. Por ejemplo, Australia es el principal exportador de software y servicios de ingeniería asociados a minería. ¿Por qué Chile no puede hacer algo parecido? ¿O por qué Argentina no puede aprovechar su potencial en el agro para convertirse en un proveedor global de servicios AgTech, de servicios digitales para la agricultura? Podemos hacer algo mejor con los commodities, con diferenciación y encadenamientos. Y con las manufacturas, América del Sur sin duda no tiene seguramente un rol para ser un gran proveedor de Estados Unidos, pero sí para ganar de nuevo mercados que perdió de mano de la competencia asiática, si avanzamos en la convergencia intrarregional. Pero el problema no es tanto la agenda, sino el cómo. Y eso es el problema que yo no sé cómo abordar y necesitamos la ayuda de muchas disciplinas. Porque el problema es no que te digan que tenés que hacer dieta, sino cuáles son tus incentivos para hacerla y con qué capacidades contás para hacer la dieta. Y entonces ese es el gran problema. El problema de economía política no es de agenda. La agenda es conocida. Lo que no sabemos es cómo encararla. Cuáles son los incentivos, los esquemas de incentivos, los esquemas de gobierno que nos pueden llevar a si existen las oportunidades, a hacer las tareas. Y dejo con un último comentario. Ayer estuvimos en último tiene que ver con inclusión y sustentabilidad, pero eso ya lo conocemos. Ayer estuvimos en una charla en donde se nos mostró en la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la UBA el enorme potencial de Vaca Muerta y que Vaca Muerta podía ser la gran estrella exportadora de la Argentina y resolver todos nuestros problemas macroeconómicos. Y mi reflexión fue, quizás es para peor. Quizás es para peor, porque esa es otra manera de postergar la otra agenda, sine die, ¿no? Digamos, total, podemos vivir del petróleo y el gas unos 20 años más y luego es como Groucho Marx, ¿no? Nuestra vida No fue larga, pero la disfrutamos bastante. Gracias.
Agradecemos al doctor Andrés López y a continuación pasamos a la ronda de preguntas y respuestas a los expositores, que será coordinada por el doctor Gerardo della Paolera, director ejecutivo de la Fundación Boone Hayborn.
¿Vos me decís? ¿No me abrís el micrófono?
Ah, sorry.
Bueno, ¿se escucha o se escucha? Bueno, buenas tardes. Estamos sobre el final, pero bueno, primero muchas gracias Adam, Timothy y Andrés. Yo tengo algo para decir, pero primero, por el corto tiempo, ¿hay alguna pregunta aquí que se quisiera hacer? Y por favor que sea corta y identificar a algunos panelistas. Cortita la pregunta, por favor. Sí.
Gracias. ¿Puedo hacer una pregunta en inglés?
Por supuesto.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Paul Segal from King's College London.
Yeah.
I have a question for Andrés, and to start with. So, Mexico is evidently the star student of globalization, and we might also add for macroeconomic stability. But Mexico has had real per capita GDP growth of about 0.5% per year for the last 20 years. So evidently, free trade, integration into global value chains, and macroeconomic stability are not sufficient for growth. So what lessons should we take from all of that data? And then, if you don't mind, a quick question for Adam. So Timothy pointed out the extremely strong incentives that there are to get back to a sustainable interdependence. So what is it that's stopping us do that? Is it just the US insistence on their own hegemony, or are there some kind of underlying economic forces that, in your view, make it more difficult to get past that?
Okay, can we take some questions, some set of questions?
Yeah.
Podemos tomar. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Sí, Beatriz, dale.
Bueno, la hago en castellano.
Sí.
Es una pregunta que está, bueno, para Adam y también para Andrés. ¿En qué medida la concentración, digamos, porque el panorama que mostró Andrés al final, que es absolutamente cierto, de la concentración de las exportaciones en commodity y la menor complejidad y diversificación, ¿en qué medida eso está relacionado con dos factores? Primero, el incremento de la demanda de China de commodities en los últimos años, y segundo, el proteccionismo agrícola, que de eso no hablamos. Yo lo hablé con Adam Tooze y con África, porque los dos grandes continentes que pueden insertarse, escalar en cadenas de valor y desarrollar cadenas de valor centradas en sus propias regiones son América Latina, en particular América del Sur y África. Pero para eso, las reglas de la globalización tiene reglas, y básicamente la OMC impuso, digamos, las reglas, pero en materia de liberalización del comercio agrícola nunca se cumplieron, porque fue un acuerdo aparte que nunca se implementó. Entonces, la posibilidad de nosotros de escalar, por ejemplo, en esa cadena de valor tan importante como la agrícola, está ligada a realmente el establecimiento de reglas multilaterales de comercio, de liberalización de comercio en el sector agrícola. Entonces, ¿en qué medida eso? Y la otra pregunta es para Timothy Sturgeon, porque, bueno, toda su gran trabajo sobre cadenas de valor está centrado en el iPhone. Entonces, la pregunta es, en la industrialización de la segunda mitad del siglo XX, el sector automotriz era el sector líder. Do you want me to make it in English?
Okay.
The question, or it's fine?
Well, English should be probably a little bit more detailed, but
okay.
Up to you.
Okay. No, my question to you is because the examples you gave about integration in global value chains were centered on the mobile phone. In the industrialization of the second half of the 20th century, the example of industrialization and the key sector for industrialization and for linkages and then for integration in global and regional value chains was the automotive sector. I remember when I was at MIT that the key sector was going to be the semiconductor sector. So afterwards, there were some reflections that maybe it was the airplane production sector, the most advanced sector of the economy. So will you consider that the mobile phone sector is the key sector for this new type of modular integration of global value chains, or these other sectors are equally important?
Okay. Is there any other questions? Yes, and then we stop, and then we go to the answers. Okay? So 2 questions more, and then.
¿Qué tal? Hago 2 preguntas breves, una para Adam y una para Andrés. So I ask in English for you, Adam, if that's okay. It may seem a bit unrelated, but I think I will eventually get there. In your book, Wages of Destruction, which I read recently and found very interesting, by the way, you argue how Germany was seeing how the US and the Soviet Union are closing the gap militarily and economically with them, and that pushes them to war with them. So I'm wondering, don't you think that eventually the US might find itself in a situation similar like to that with China, not today, not tomorrow, but seeing that the gap is closing at a very fast pace, might we see a world like that at some point? Y después para Andrés, bueno, la típica pregunta-opinión, ¿no? Pero quizás, no, digo, planteabas Estados Unidos como el hub natural para la región latinoamericana y en particular también para el Mercosur. Y me pregunto, ¿no? Digo, dado que Estados Unidos no tiene prácticamente ningún interés en el Mercosur como un spoke de estas cadenas de valor, digamos, ¿no puede ser ese en definitiva el impedimento crucial a la hora de integrarnos a cadenas de valor? Uno quiere ser optimista en general con la idea de que integrarse a cadenas de valor puede ser una estrategia de inserción exportadora y dinamismo exportador. Sin embargo, dadas todas las contras que tenemos y la ausencia absoluta de un hub, más allá de uno que nos mira de reojo y la incapacidad de Brasil, digo, ¿tenemos alguna posibilidad en ese sentido? Gracias. Y disculpas la extensión.
Benny, ¿quieres hacer una? Benny, vos? Una? No. Okay, so let's, please, the floor is yours. Whoever wants to start.
Oh, okay. On Mexico, you ask, why, if it's so well integrated into GVCs, and macroeconomics are looking good, why has there been low GDP growth? I think there's multiple answers to that, I would imagine. But in terms of global value chains, that's the whole point. It's a question of what business functions are carried out in Mexico versus somewhere else. So it's part of a chain of linked business functions, and some of those business functions give more power and more profits and kind of more control in the chain than others. So what Mexico's doing, there's more and more engineering work going on in Mexico, but it's also derivative. And Mexico is like right close in the same time zone for many places in the U.S. So there's lots of things that are growing and doing well. But by and large, you're mainly kind of doing low value added work. So I think that's the mixed bag of, as Timmer et al. Would say, of global value chains. In terms of ag, I just want to jump in on that. I think that ag gets agricultural kind of exports get a bad rap. I think, for example, Brazil is a huge exporter of resource-related goods, but there's not much value added to that. Except for in coffee. And the story with coffee is that there was a really interesting program, the Apex program, that was really coming out of some demand by Illy Coffee to show there was a training to how to upgrade the coffee production to make good quality, like Italian level coffee. That got kind of codified and regularized and rolled out. That's my understanding of the story, working with the IDB years ago. And that rolled out to the rest of the industry. And now we have specialty coffee from Minas Gerais and other places. And so there's a success story. But that's it. There's really, if you even look at what Guatemala is doing with kind of fine vegetables, snow peas and string beans and to the U.S. market, I think there's been a lot more done. And then there's a bunch of technology-related additions to agriculture in terms of precision agriculture, in terms of new products derived from agricultural goods that hasn't really, there's a lot of talk about that, but it hasn't been worked on aggressively enough, in my opinion. And the main thing is that there's not a push for exports out of Latin America. It's not a it's all kind of back to this import substitution idea that we just need whatever we're selling here. We need this consumption driven. Whatever we're selling here, we need to make it here. But that gets you the double. It's a double hit. You get what Mexico has, which is low value added stuff, and you don't have the export growth to go with it. So it's you're just limited to the domestic market. So I think that there's outward more outward looking stance, not only with exports but also with outward investment. So companies in Latin America who have gone out and bought companies around the world have done very well. JBS, but also a few automotive suppliers, Ethiopian Maxion and others from Brazil, and we have a Basso here in Argentina that's a really good at exporting valves. What they're going to do with EVs is another question. The question about the iPhone, I mean, it's a really good question, and I didn't, it's just an extreme case of how the ICT industry is interdependent and modularized like this. The question of, industries are really different. So the automobile industry, and you can see it in Andres' data, it's not there's not a lot of exports or autos. It's politically, if you're going to sell a lot of cars in a place, you're going to make them there. It's just kind of the way that industry has been ever since the U.S. kind of reacted to imports from Japan back in the 80s. They said, no, if you're going to build, you have to build where you sell. That never kicked in with iPhones, So why is that? I mean, that's a kind of good, it's almost like a psychological question. People like cars, we have to have them here. So so then aircraft and other industries are really different. What we do, the argument we do explicitly make in our paper, though, is that the iPhone is a part of an ICT sector. And the way the ICT sector is organized is not like the automobile industry. There's not like 11 big firms in the whole world that control everything. There's thousands of firms making products. It's all linked together in this modular way. So is that special? Yeah, it is. But ICT and the way of organizing ITC industries is colonizing more and more industries. If you think about not just goods, but software, digital services, there's more and more companies in different sectors that are they're turning into IT companies. Every big company has like people writing software and experimenting with AI and other things like that. So I think it's a kind of big chunk, but if you want to go look at solar panels or aircraft or autos, you're going to see something quite different. That's why when we do global value chain research, we go industry by industry, because what you'll see is quite different. And I just want to say the U.S. is a hub for Mercosur. Yeah, I don't know why that's a given. If you're going to do friend shoring, who's your friend? Is the U.S. your friend? I'm not sure. It's just something to think about. I mean, not every country in the world is making the decision to go with that group. But the OECD countries, are not completely cohesive, but they still have a lot of power in most of these industries. But I think that's an open question.
Okay, thank you.
I'll start with the agricultural question. I mean, I think it's important to differentiate, isn't it, between agriculture as in ag industry, the agro-industrial complex of the type that we're familiar with in Latin America, and the situation in Africa, which is peasant-based, where the population pressure is enormous, where we're really looking at far more fundamental problems of economic development. So that's, as it were, one distinction I would make to start with. though clearly it's true that for both Africa and Latin America, there may be comparative advantage in this sector. The second observation I'd make is about the framing of this problem in terms of the WTO process or massively complex, comprehensive multilateral frameworks. I guess you and I share an interest in the work of Chuck Sable. You invoked his work in the 80s. Right now, with people like David Victor, he's elaborating a new framework for really thinking about the legal regulation and the treaty frameworks for understanding globalization. And both in the area of climate politics and with regard to trade, they're quite fundamentally skeptical about the utility and the future relevance of massively comprehensive global frameworks, right? And clearly the future of complex trade policy has been largely regional, if not industrial, as Tim has laid out for us. And presumably the same thing will be true if we're looking forward for thinking about the way in which agriculture might figure in Africa's relationships. They would presumably be with Europe going forward, right? And that is then a question of how you bolt a promising agricultural development model into Europe's common agricultural policy, basically. And that's a problem which has been posed to the Europeans ever since the colonial era in the 1950s and early 1960s, and still, I think, is with us today. So that will be the direction I think my thoughts would go in there. We also, of course, need to fit agriculture more generally into the struggle for the energy transition or more generally decarbonisation, and it's a huge challenge. On the other points, I'll be brief. One question was the question about whether or not, as it were, there's an economic logic behind the increasing tension between the West and China. And then there was the question, as it were, of the historic parallels to the tensions in the 1930s. I mean, to start with the historical analogy, it's a slightly strained comparison, because my argument about Nazi Germany in the interwar period, or many of the challenges, Italian fascism, Imperial Japan, was that they saw the rise of American power prospectively, and from a position of inferiority decided to make desperate gambles to forestall the development of a future massively against the odds. And that doesn't well describe our current situation, other than if you take China to be the aggressive player in this game, and as it were to be, and some people argue this, that China sees as it were a limited window of opportunity before demographic factors begin to really retard it, before it hits the middle income trap, and if it's ever going to make a bid, this is the window with which it has to make a bid. So that would be one model for understanding this. The more widely touted historical analogy, believe it or not, for the current moment in the US is the notorious Thucydides trap, right, which literally goes back to Athens and Sparta, and somehow tries to, and then maybe by way of Imperial Germany and in Britain in 1914, somehow manages to press those into service. I frankly don't find any of these models very compelling. I don't think history repeats that way. But to go to your point, I do think that it is a quite explicitly articulated American resistance to the idea of a fundamental challenge from China that drives the positioning of American policy in the current moment. And in a sense, I just wish they would take more notice of what Tim's saying, because if you listen to you, really, there's no reason to be panicking here, right? China is nowhere near a position, really, of overtaking. But you can see in domain after domain, I mean, there was a very hawkish report on artificial intelligence earlier in the year, which articulated a very strong position that preemptively America needs to secure dominance. They then also raised the dominance objectives, right? You need to be not just one generation ahead, but 2 or 3 generations ahead. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a chip gap or something like that. So this landscape can be modulated in different directions, and this isn't to deny China's agency. China is itself a proactive agent with its own geo-economic ambitions. But I do think the radical thing that's happened in the last 2 years is that Washington has just begun to draw a new set of lines. I don't think much of the impetus for that comes from the business sector. Given Timothy's description of like what that ecosystem looks like, it's not obvious that any American corporate player has any particular interest. Maybe you have a different take on this, but my sense also from reading the work of Chad Brown and people like that is that there's really not much business push. I mean, sure, if Congress is offering them tens of billions of dollars in subsidy, they'll take it. But not, and this was important, right, not if it comes with a string attached that they are no longer allowed to invest in China. And that they shut down. These guardrails which they had taken out, which are driving the Republicans crazy. Because if that's the price you pay, then it's not worth the candle, right? Because you have to be able to maintain your capacity to cooperate in this complex ecosystem, and that may require some investment. And the Democrats listened to that and allowed them to have those opt-outs, as far as I understand it. Yeah.
Okay. Andrés,
sí. Bueno, a ver, con relación a México, no soy un experto, pero voy a tomar lo que dijo Tim. Primero, el tema de las funciones en las cadenas de valor, él se lo explicó, pero también no han avanzado mucho en encadenamientos locales. Es decir, cuando uno mira el valor agregado local, la producción de autos, o por ejemplo aviones, componentes aeronáuticos, que es más reciente, etcétera, es bastante bajo. O sea que en realidad el modelo maquila ha avanzado un poco, pero no sustancialmente, ¿no? Digamos, y esto tiene que ver con la escasa capacidad de productores mexicanos de convertirse en proveedores globales, porque la lógica de la cadena de valor es, empiezo importando insumos importados para procesarlos y exportar, y luego me voy especializando, quizás encuentro que en algunos nichos de esos insumos puedo convertirme en un proveedor eficiente y empiezo a exportar esos insumos, ¿no? Ese es el camino asiático. México no ha sido capaz de recorrer eso, y tampoco Costa Rica y tampoco Dominicana en general. Y además del tema que mencionaba Tim de que en general son actividades de valor agregado en la cadena. Pero además, bueno, el libro de Santiago Levy sobre México es bastante claro el diagnóstico, la alta heterogeneidad, el altísimo nivel de informalidad en los mercados de bienes y de trabajo, y la persistencia de zonas de muy baja productividad, incluso a nivel regional. Una cosa es, de vuelta al norte, si vamos a Oaxaca o a Chiapas, no ha pasado mucho en integración en la cadena global. Con relación a Mercosur, yo digo que es el hub porque está menos lejos que otros, ¿no? Digamos, y en un mundo donde los costos de transporte, por ejemplo, Estados Unidos es un hub para la exportación de servicios basados en conocimiento. La mayor parte de las exportaciones latinoamericanas de servicios basados en conocimiento van a Estados Unidos. Eso sí, una lógica geográfica, ¿no? Y aparte de la lógica de costos. Ahora, si vamos a exportar bienes, hay otros países que están mucho más cerca. Incluso, por supuesto, el Mercosur está más lejos que otros países de América Latina, de América del Sur. Pero el Mercosur a su vez no ha logrado, ni creo que logre, lamentablemente, constituir una dinámica endógena al estilo de la que pudo haberse construido en el este de Asia, ¿no? Digamos, porque no tenemos de vuelta, no hay una economía líder. Brasil no va a ser Japón. Punto. No, digo, no, por lo menos mientras vivamos lo que estamos acá. Entonces yo creo que eso es un límite, y por eso me parece que hay que explotar lo de los commodities, y esto me lleva a lo que dice Beatriz, ¿no? O sea, evidentemente uno piensa con el aumento de precios, parte de lo que yo mostré es que los precios, ¿no? Digamos, te hacen la tarea. Ahora, pero ¿cuál sería el camino virtuoso con los commodities? Porque Australia también depende de la exportación de commodities, pero le agrega otras cosas, ¿no? Digamos, le agrega servicio de ingeniería, por ejemplo, de software, etcétera, y esta es la tarea que nosotros no estamos haciendo, ni tampoco estamos avanzando mucho con la diferenciación. Entonces, de vuelta, si yo tengo 80% de mis exportaciones de América del Sur en commodities, eso me expone, por un lado, a la volatilidad, a los shocks de precios y cantidades. Por ejemplo, todos estamos apostando al litio. Mañana, el litio, porque hoy vale $30.000 la tonelada, no sé, mañana se descubre una manera de sacar litio en horas de los salares, porque el litio sale de un salario, ni siquiera hay que romper una roca, nada. El litio va a pasar a valer $100, no sé, la tonelada, porque va a haber litio en todo el planeta, es uno de los elementos más comunes de todo el planeta. Contrariamente a lo que se cree, uno de los elementos más comunes del planeta es el litio. El problema que hay es que es muy caro sacarlo. El día, y hay un montón de empresas queriendo sacar litio de una manera más eficiente, esas técnicas avancen, el precio del litio, ¿qué va a pasar? Va a bajar brutalmente. Los chips no van a bajar 10 veces de precio de un año a otro. No va a pasar eso, como pasa con nuestros commodities. Entonces, yo creo que ese es el problema. En vez de ir reduciendo nuestra exposición a shocks, la estamos aumentando. Ese es mi punto, ¿no? Y creo que ahí la manera de reducirla es aprovechando nuestra base de recursos naturales para diferenciar y diversificar a través de plataformas de encadenamientos de bienes y servicios, y luego el comercio intrarregional. Ahí creo que tenemos mucho para avanzar en la agenda intrarregional de comercio, pero ¿qué avances? Cuénteme los avances en Mercosur en los últimos 20 años. Vos, Beatriz, por ejemplo, ¿no? Lo podés contar, ¿no? ¿Qué avanzamos? Y Mercosur y CAN, ¿qué avanzamos? Y ALADI, ¿no? No solo los aranceles, toda la convergencia profunda, que todos sabemos, ¿no? Toda esa agenda, ¿cuánto se avanzó? Convergencia regulatoria, temas de inversiones, servicios, nada, muy poco, muy poco. Y yo creo que ahí entonces hay también un tema de voluntad política ¿no? A nivel de la región, que me parece que también ha faltado.
Bueno, gracias Andrés, gracias a todos por venir. Son las 19 horas, así que muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Tim, thank you, Adam.